Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. I grew up in British Columbia, which is the most western province of Canada, bordered by the Pacific Ocean to the west, the Rocky Mountains in Alberta to the east, while the province extends north to the Yukon and Northwestern Territories. I was raised close to the bustling, spectacular, charming city of Nelson, BC, a city that is nestled in the Sircon Mountains on the west arm of the deep smoky grey Kootenay Lake, which when spread out under the sparkling luminescence of a bright sunny morning, transforms into the most beautiful jade green that you've ever seen in your life, that can quite literally take your breath away and leave you to conclude that we live in a shire. But the nearby Slocan River can upstage the Kootenay River any day in terms of its viridescent green hue, which simply cannot be rivalled. Nelson, BC is like a cake with many delicious flavours and distinctive unique layers that make it stand up proudly and tall in any crowd, for it oozes character and charm like the frothy cream from a chocolate eclair. Consequently, the indelible influences of a thriving French culture, along with a sizable French-speaking population, has left its poignant indelible mark on the city, where style, savoir-faire and finesse are in bountiful supply. Ostensibly, it is a buzzing city that may be accused of being many things, but dull, boring, nondescript, it most certainly is not. The city is teeming with locals and intrepid explorers alike, all looking to enjoy the delicious fruits of what British Columbia has to offer. Let's just say the huge drawing card for so many visitors here is to stay in an exquisite waterfront elaborate boutique hotel, or to enjoy the pleasurable benefits of the hot spring resorts here, golfing opportunities or whitewater rafting, or to engage in the glitzy sparkle of the nightlife from the exciting dance clubs, incredible theatres, musical venues, pubs, and exciting places to eat. For indeed it is a sumptuous haven for funky avant-garde and eclectic speciality shops, along with great cosmopolitan shopping opportunities. Then there are the art galleries, museums, alluring back lanes, exciting outdoor excursions of every single kind to tickle your fancies. So yes, it would seem that Nelson, BC has the quintessential marriage between the natural world and New Age sophistication blended together in a seamless duo, as if they had never ever been apart. And so, to avoid sounding like a travel brochure introducing you to the delights of Nelson, BC, let me get on with my story that will ultimately invoke in you a mixed multitude of emotions, from horror, disgust, revulsion, astonishment, awesome wonder, and joy. A perfect cacophony of inspiring flavours, shall we say, some that you may rather not taste or find very palatable, but without tasting one, you might not appreciate the significance of all the others. All the events that unfolded are a significant part of the puzzle that creates my extraordinary story, that is also very likely to bring a tear to your eye, as it does to mine every time I ever think about it. If one piece is missing of the puzzle, the whole puzzle is seriously compromised. So buckle up, enjoy the ride, and come on this adventure with me. I grew up in an old wood and stone burgundy and white Romanesque style Victorian home, with towers, torrents, domers, a pitch shingle roof, double-hung windows, and a wraparound porch. Our house was often referred to by many as the haunted house on the hill, as postulating rumours abounded that our house was some kind of portal between this world and the next. The idle speculation and conjecture had no credible credence or weighty validation, for it was all based on hearsay or idle gossip. But I could understand where those rumours came from, for our house did possess a menacing, formidable energy that was less than savoury. I never witnessed anything untoward in our home beyond the intelligible phenomenon of the physical world. To all intensive purposes, any ethereal, ghostly footsteps that trailed down the passageway at night were not of the spectral kind, and any suppressed, vanquished, or repressed cries in the darkness of this dusky night, after the sound of the grandfather clock struck the witching hour, were not uttered by disembodied voices at all. Although, believe me, there were cries, and many of them too, that filtered through the walls of our home, the woeful, sad energy ravenously sucked up by the stone and wood. Among those hushed voices were the unheard voices of an aching heart, desperate to be heard, that had so easily been abandoned and forsaken, most especially by the people that were supposed to care the most. So yes, you could say the locals were not wrong about the hauntings in our home, but they were not of the paranormal or supernatural kind. For lurking in the dark shadows, stalking his prey with an insatiable, ravenous and obscene appetite, was a predator of note, whom under the cover of this murky twilight, with the curtains drawn and the light switched off, would undauntedly cautiously move through the house in pursuit of his quarry. I lived in this historic residence with both my parents and my younger brother Carlson. Our freakishly outer-worldly house was situated on a hill with a scattering of fruit trees in our yard, the scant remnants of the old orchards that used to grace the foothills of Nelson, BC. Black bears were a constant welcome visitor to our property, feasting on all the fallen hazelnuts and fruit that decadently graced the earthen ground so generously, with a feast of edible delights. So forget leaving bin bags out there, or even a bird feeder. With those bears around, that was never ever going to happen. But despite the downsides of their visits, they were so cute and comical to watch, but they most certainly ramshackled everything. I wish I could say I grew up in a happy home. After all, with such exquisite, prepossessing, unabashful scenery surrounding us at every turn, you would expect it to unequivocally complement and enhance the quality of our lives. This, I regret to say, was certainly not the case. It bears a remarkable, striking commonality with social media platforms today, where celebrities are notorious for ingeniously parading their lives like dirty laundry in front of their admiring, adoring fans. Their laundry appears to morph into fabulous, enviable, glittering pieces of jewellery that others so wish they owned, not really knowing that the sparkling jewels in question were really just pieces of shattered glass all along. For the false visual impressions, incredible holidays abroad, happy faces, bountiful laughter, all masked a vacuous emptiness, while the vast enviable treasure that made you green at the gills was in fact only an empty box that contained nothing at all. For we live in a deceptively enticing world, where the glitzy appearances of others are not all as they seem. It was certainly that case for my life, for on the surface to the outside or casual observer, we seemed to have everything. In truth, we had nothing at all. Absolutely nothing. Even from a very young age, I knew instinctively that something was terribly wrong with my father, as his behaviour towards us was peculiarly strange, so much so that I could never put a finger on it. He was always the first eager beaver father to arrive at the school gate to pick us up, seemingly itching at the seams to assert his audacious, flagrant friendliness towards my brother's friends, with a little too much enthusiasm for my liking. "And how are you, Johnny, today?" he would say, rubbing one of the boy's heads of bouncy brown hair. "Get up to any mischief?" he would tease affectionately. "Of course not, Mr. Blanchard. I'm always a good boy." My brother's friends all thought my dad was remarkably cool, yet when it came to my own girlfriends, my father never so much as gave them a passing glance, or even a friendly, lingering nod. You could have probably put a bucket of mud on one of their heads, and he would have been none the wiser about it. My father's fixation was literally on the young boys, like a stationary telescope on the high seas, focused on one angle only. I would often follow my father's impassionate gaze, see his lascivious eyes focusing on a young blonde boy. Always a boy, it would seem, that was a tad feminine, rather pretty, very innocent. He reminded me of a leopard, as his salacious gaze would linger over the boy for far too long, uncomfortably long, that even I would flush with embarrassment on his account. Ostensibly it bothered me that he was so different to the other fathers at the school gate, less friendly, more guarded, very wary towards other adults. You're supposed to grow up idolizing your father, looking at him through rose-coloured glasses, but I always knew and sensed something was amiss with my own. I had seen how my friends' fathers interacted with their own children, with hearts worn on their sleeves, with a warm friendliness complemented by protective paternal instincts, offering always wise guidance and instruction to them. How I envied those relationships. Why could my father not be normal like one of them, I would wonder? In those days I was a light sleeper, would awaken regularly to the sound of feet stealthily creeping across the passage floor, trying their damnedest to remain hushed, but failing abysmally in their approach. It would be about midnight when the tick-tocking grandfather clock struck the hour with a resounding high-pitched chime. I was always awoken with a start, jumping out of my skin like a frightened cat from a bathtub of ice-cold water. The heavy chime shook me out of my slumber so violently that my awareness was heightened. I'm afraid any pit-patter of footsteps on those old inlaid planks of mixed Brazilian cherry and walnut flooring could be easily discerned, not easily suppressed or subdued by any manner of means. I could hear the creaks, the groans, the clacks. I would watch my father, clad in his pinstripe pyjamas, swathed in his blue sleeping gown and slippers, waver outside my brother's door, expressing a level of hesitancy as to whether he should enter or not. His fingers would tremble and twitch on the doorknob. Then he would twist the handle open, ever so slowly, at first with reluctance, followed by an assertive boldness, as his confidence escalated like the flames on a gas hob. Even before he entered the bedroom, he would clandestinely look up and down the passageway, furtively, as if he was afraid that someone had actually seen him coming. I would be there, hiding behind a tall spider plant. I would remain so very still, so inconspicuous, barely even drawing breath, so he never ever saw me. Slowly but surely he would discreetly push the door inwards, then close it silently behind him, so you could hear a little click. Then a key would turn in the lock, so that my father had locked himself in my brother's bedroom. He would stay in there for over 20 minutes. Then I would see him covertly sneaking away again, always wearing a guilty I shouldn't have done that look on his face that I could see so clearly, as the soft pale landing light was always kept on during the night. I was about 12 at the time, my brother only 10. I couldn't fathom what my father was doing visiting my brother in the middle of the night, when he could see him during the full light of the day. Why all this duplicitous secrecy? Did my mother even know about this, I wondered? My innocent, naive mind could not comprehend what he was up to, but I was instinctive enough to sense that something was intrinsically wrong. I first broached the subject with my brother with a straight in-your-face question, with no frills or double meanings attached to my words. "Why does Dad visit you during the night?" I asked, at which my brother's expression went from a flushed pink colour to a pale white as the colour drained from his face. His blue eyes became fearful. "How do you know?" he whispered. "I saw him," I said. "I saw him sneak into your room. What does he want?" "Irma, you can't tell anybody about this. Dad says if I tell anyone, I'll get into big trouble. Big trouble." I tried to get more out of my brother, but he was unrelentingly clamming up like a mussel in a shell, refusing to say a single word. I then propounded the subject with my mother. "Mummy, why does Daddy always visit Carson during the night when the clock strikes midnight?" My mother became incensed with me, as if I'd said something terrible. "Now, don't you go talking about your father like that, Irma. He's a good man," she said, as if trying to convince herself of this very fact. "A very good man indeed," she insisted. "You can't go slamming him down with such outrageous accusations, Irma. You should be ashamed of yourself." Accusations, I wondered. What on earth was she talking about? I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I was asking my mother a simple question, but she had just snapped my head off. I noticed in the days and weeks that passed my brother was changing. He was not the fun-loving brother I'd always known before, but became nervous and apprehensive, rather like a crystal-clear watercourse becoming infested with algae. Even at dinner-time he always wittingly avoided my father's gaze, keeping his eyes strategically fixed on his dinner plate and switching off the conversation like a control on a radio station. He was always disengaged, detached, indifferent. "Carlson," my mother would pipe, "for goodness sake, stop playing with your peas. We're not in a bowling alley. If you don't want to eat them, put them to one side of your plate. I just can't abide people fiddling with their food. Are you not going to tell me and your father what you did at school today?" "We had a test in math today," my brother would say, his words so flat they would make a pencil look crooked. "Well, how did you do then, sweetheart?" "I think I did all right," he would say, remaining resolutely aloof. "Good! I'm so glad to hear it. After all, you need excellent grades if you want to get into medical school, don't you?" "I don't want to go to medical school," my brother would snap. "I'm going to be an artist." "Well, that's all well and good, sweetheart. It's only famous artists that actually make big money. I doubt you're going to be famous. It's only that 2% that make it really big. It's rather like winning the lottery. Luck plays an intrinsic part. You should focus your attentions on a lucrative career. You could become a plastic surgeon one day. They make lots and lots of money enhancing people's assets and appearances. You could apply your creativity there. Make a fortune out of people's vanity. It's a huge, thriving business. Nothing to be sniffed at, dear. Think about it. Most plastic surgeons live in sprawling mansions, own fancy yachts, have amazing holidays abroad. That could be you. Much better than being an artist any day of the week. What's his name? That Picasso guy? Oh, he didn't make it big until long after he'd popped his clogs. I mean, you don't want that to happen to you." "I don't want to be a doctor or a surgeon," my brother growled. "I want to be an artist." My mother wilfully ignored my brother's belligerence, turning her attention directly on me. "What about you, Irma? Did you have a good day today?" I would wrinkle up my nose in disgust. It was all right, I'd say. "Good, I'm glad to hear it, sweetheart." One day I decided to hide in my brother's closet. I was determined to see what my father got up to on his nightly visitations to my brother's bedroom. What I was to uncover would send my blood running cold. For I was to learn that my lecherous father was the most despicable monster of the worst possible kind. I could hear beyond the soft snores of my brother the door handle turn, click open, the door open and then close behind itself, the key turning in the lock, followed by my father's footsteps padding towards my brother's bed. "Carlson, are you awake?" My brother did not answer. I'm almost certain he was pretending to be asleep. Who could blame him? My father wasn't easily put off. "Quit the play acting, Carlson. Wake up. I know you're not asleep. You're not fooling anyone, least of all me." "I want to sleep, Dad. Please go away. I'm tired." "Don't push me away, son. Wake up. Let's have some fun together, shall we?" "I don't want to, Dad," came the muffled voice of my brother. Please don't make me. I've got a headache. I don't feel too good." "You'll do as I say, son. You wouldn't want your mother to find out what you get up to, would you?" "All right," my brother groaned, "but please make it quick. I'm very tired." I could hear my father grunting as he straddled my helpless brother like a lion pouncing upon his prey. I swung open the closet door to find my father in a very compromising position. I will spare you the graphic, unsightly details, but know this, you can't unsee what I witnessed then. For I realized my salacious, licentious father was a monster of the worst, most deplorable kind. I despised everything he was doing to my poor brother. He was supposed to be my brother's protector, but he was his abuser, who cared not about his welfare, but only about titillating his shameless, profane and obscene fantasies. I began to hit my father hundreds of times, over and over again. How could you? How could you do that? How could you do that? "What are you doing here, Irma?" he barked. "Get back to bed now. If you tell your mother what you've seen tonight, you'll be in serious trouble. Do you understand?" I nodded, dashing out of my brother's room, the tears spilling down my face, for my heart was broken like a chicken's egg. For seeing my father abuse my brother like this hit me like a brick to the head. My father was undeniably a paedophile. I'd heard about such people before. It made absolute sense to me now. Fully explained the sneaking into my brother's room at ungodly hours of the night, and the constant ogling of young boys at the school gate. I was sobbing into my pillow, that was now completely saturated by the deluge of my own tears, when I heard my father enter my bedroom. His eyes looked scared. He was actually trembling. "Irma, you're not going to breathe a word about what you witnessed tonight. This is strictly between me and your brother. It's no one else's business. Do you understand?" "But you're hurting Carlton," I blubbered. "He doesn't want you to do what you're doing to him." "That's where you're wrong, Irma," said my father. It was after I had done a great deal of research on the subject of paedophilia that I was able to assure my brother Carlson that my father's immoral, debaucherous behaviour was not normal, but morally wrong and reprehensible. I also managed to persuade him that he wasn't to blame for what had transpired between the two of them, as my father had been the nefarious instigator of those wanton, dark practices. Me and my brother considered all our options. Should we run away from home together? At first the idea seemed promising, although where would we go? We hardly wanted to end up on the streets in a worse state than we were now. You saw people like that everywhere, high on drugs, inebriated by alcohol, caught up in prostitution. So we knew that that was not a viable option for us, for if we went to social services, we could invariably end up being placed in foster care. We'd both heard negative stories about children running away from abusive environments, so we didn't want that for ourselves. We also knew that telling my mother about our father's insidious, scabrous behaviour would be like hitting our heads against a brick wall. We both secretly suspected she already knew about my father's nighttime visitations to my brother's bedroom. She had conveniently just turned a blind eye. So turning to her for help would be like asking a barnacle to shift off a turtle's shell. It wasn't going to happen. Then there was the police, and that didn't sit well with us either. We were sure the social services would invariably end up getting involved somewhere down the line, and that was not good news. We trusted the social services about as much as we would our heads in an alligator's mouth. It was then that I had the most marvellous idea. "Carlton, you can hide out in the old barn. You remember the one in the woods? I'll bring you all the food you need. Mum and Dad will never know you're there. I'll bring you books to read, stuff like that. You can paint to your heart's content in there." The old barn or outbuilding, whatever you want to call it, held many treasured memories of our early life playing in the woods together. It was situated in a densely forested area, not far away from our home. I imagine its former owners in bygone years had possibly used it for storage purposes. It was in remarkably good condition, seamlessly hidden away in the heart of the colourful ribbon of deciduous trees such as birch and aspen, along with conifers like cedars, hemlocks and ponderosa pines. It would be the last place in the entire world my parents would ever consider looking for my brother, the quintessential inconspicuous hiding spot. So our plan rolled into action as we began to make the barn cosy and comfortable, with blankets, sleeping bags, a kerosene lamp, an old mattress, along with my brother's easel, canvases and paints. Before long, after a great deal of cleaning and sweeping, it looked halfway decent. We even cleared out the old fireplace, packing it with wood. The barn had been superbly built, with 100-year-old timber beams, so there were no leaks in the roof. I knew my brother would be safe and warm in there, and that was all that mattered in my humble opinion. My brother had left a little note in his bedroom which read, "Sorry, Dad. I had to go. I'm not coming back. If you come after me, I'll tell the police about everything you did. Carlton." I kid you not that after my father found the note in my brother's bedroom, he didn't call the police, as any normal father would have done, for he wore the guilt on his face like an extra item of clothing on his body. My father seemed very scared, rather like a deer caught up in headlights, so he queried not Carlton's absence from our home. When my mother even mentioned going to the police to file a missing persons report, he barked at her like an aggressive bull terrier, and she shrank in the corners, so she shut up and said nothing. Even the school was informed that Carlton had gone to Ireland to live with his grandmother. No one batted an eyelid or even raised a quizzical brow. This is Carlton's side of the story. People always talk about the monsters that lurk in the woods. They fail to tell you about the ones living under your own roof. Those are the worst monsters of all, as they operate with stealth and cunning, using the dark shadows of the night to conceal their treacherous, insidious crimes. My father was one of those monsters. At least I would credit an angry bear or a ferocious mountain lion or even a snapping crocodile as having more integrity than my own father. For if they desire to eat you, it will be plain to see. My father hid his nefarious intentions behind the veneer of a congenial face, but in his heart a darkness prevailed that was so vulgar it was oppressive. I was exceedingly blessed to have such a discerning sister like Irma, who enabled me to escape my father's treacherous clutches, opening my eyes to what he was doing to me, showing me that it was morally wrong and not my fault. I was terrified of my father, loathing, despising, hating him with every fibre of my being. I remember when I moved into that barn for the first time in my life, even though I was young, I felt happy, truly, truly happy. I didn't even miss school, as since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, my passion has always been art. So I knew I could paint, paint and paint to my heart's content, and there was nothing I would rather have done. When I grew up, I would become an artist, despite my mother's protests. It was a no-brainer for me. I did sometimes take a bus into the city, wander around art galleries to get inspirational ideas. I was lucky as my grandmother, who lived in Ireland, placed large chunks of money into our accounts for birthdays and Christmases, so I could buy anything I needed, including materials for my artwork. I knew that the police were not looking for me, nor had any missing persons report been filed, so I felt remarkably safe. Every day I would sit in the wooded area with my easel and paint. I loved to paint all the trees in the forest or anything in nature that grabbed my attention, like a squirrel or a chipmunk or even a fox, and even the flowers that festooned the hillsides with fabulous spring showings of sweet peas, chicory, Indian paintbrush and mullein, were also an incredible delight to transfer onto an artist's canvas. One day as I was painting, I heard a very strange, peculiar sound. I could hear heavy bipedal feet moving stealthily as they crunched twigs, leaves and forest debris beneath heavy soles. I became naturally apprehensive, fearing that my father might have cottoned on to my whereabouts. I looked around pensively, my restless paintbrush twitching nervously in my hand. Then I saw her. She was peering at me through the trees behind a lacy curtain of pretty foliage, unable to disguise her curiosity, as she seemed interested in what I was doing. It was then that I realized that this anomalous creature was a Bigfoot. I was absolutely stunned, for never in my wildest dreams had I expected to encounter such an outlandish creature, up so close and personal. I've known about Bigfoot all my life, for indeed stories about their presence in British Columbia are rife. Many believe the cryptozoologist theory that these creatures are apes is completely off the mark. They are right, these creatures are not apes by any manner of means. Instead, many people here believe a Bigfoot is another species of human with some innate supernatural abilities. In my opinion, they're onto the money there. As the Bigfoot stood there watching me, her energy was so gentle, so soft, so kind, so serene, so peaceful. I think she might have been sheepishly observing me for many days, weeks even, as indeed there had been anguished, vacillating times that I'd been almost certain I was being watched. I had put those incongruous, nonsensical feelings down to being over-neurotic on my part, about my father being hot on my trail. Now she was showing herself to me, as if I had sequentially earned her trust for this poignant reveal. It was a privilege to meet her. I assure you there was no part of me that was even a teensy-weensy bit afraid of her, for she candidly wore her heart on her sleeve, as though her thoughts were almost transparent. Granted, the sizable creature with her pyramid-shaped head, human face, deep-set dark eyes, was exceedingly tall. She was about 8 foot, 3 foot wide across the shoulders, and possibly about 700 pounds. But there are no words to describe how humongous she was in size. But she was a gentle giant, with not a malevolent, vicious bone in her entire body. She was swathed in long flowing auburn-coloured hair, that was scanter under her arms and her knees, and the area on the lower legs where her arms brush against her body. I will profess that she was a very powerful, intimidating creature, but nonetheless I knew I had nothing to fear. The Bigfoot, with her delightful heart-shaped feminine face, high cheekbones and deeply furrowed forehead, stood still watching me paint for a few days, keeping a safe distance from me, as if testing the water before deciding to actually take the plunge. I felt as if she was reading me rather like a book. I now realise that she was absolutely telepathic. So it seems the indigenous people of British Columbia are absolutely right. Bigfoots have superior powers beyond that of our own. I remember one day I was thinking that I wished she'd come closer to me. In a trice, after those thoughts floated in my mind, she perceived them, as if I'd spoken them directly to her. She promptly glided to my side, as if to say, "At last you've invited me into your space. I've been waiting for you to ask me." I was soon to realise that Bigfoots are very big on space, boundaries and territorial markers. Before long, I'd given the Bigfoot a canvas and was showing her how to paint. I'll never forget the thrilled expression in those dark eyes of hers as she proceeded to paint. She marvelled at the paint colours, when how you mixed them together you could create new colours. She loved using her fingers to work the paint together, instead of using a brush. The first thing she painted was a red maple tree. I hadn't expected her first attempts to be so startlingly lifelike, but she was a natural-born artist. I was flummoxed for her understanding of the natural world. She understood the concepts of art, from shape, texture, light shading, stuff like that people tend to need to learn from an art teacher, but she understood those concepts as if they were ingrained in her psyche. Over the next few weeks I would see the creature on and off pretty regularly. We developed a close, unlikely friendship. She always brought a smile to my face, for she loved mimicking my facial expressions. We would eat together, but food of the human kind. She offered me a piece of dead squirrel from time to time. I always refused her offerings. We would talk to each other telepathically. I struggled with communicating in such an absurd way in the beginning, but I soon began to trust the voice in my mind. When she wasn't around, I rarely missed her, for she had wormed her way into my heart. Her name was Kamama, which she told me meant butterfly. I was to learn that there is a Cherokee name exactly the same with the same meaning. So does Bigfoot have some connection to the Cherokee Nation, I wonder? She told me she was only passing through the area and would not be there for very long, as before she settled down with a partner, she was desirous to do a little travelling. Something her kind always invariably did while they were young, as when they got older, they had to take much more responsibilities in raising their own kids, where family members would also take turns in child-minding duties. She was very glad her parents had chosen a suitable partner for her, as her kind are monogamous and stay together for life, as often the partners are selected by both parents. By all accounts, she thought he was an attractive-looking male, whom she described as having gentle, soulful eyes. "I always look at the eyes," she told me. "Into the depths of them. You can see the heart of a man." I was to learn his name was Achi, which is Cherokee for woods. She liked Achi very much, because he wasn't too full of himself, as some of those male suitors tend to be, who were very big on showing off, flaunting their assets and thumping their chests wildly to extract as much female attention as possible. She did say that some young, unattached Bigfoot males could be very egotistical, big-headed and dominating. Her parents had wanted her to partner up with a young Bigfoot called Jitsu, which means trickster rabbit in Cherokee. She told her parents she didn't like him at all. He was cantankerous, grumpy, very noisy when he ate his food, when he slashed his jaws together with a horrible crunching sound that she simply couldn't abide. Worse still, he was never inclined to share, and had been known to hide berries and nuts from his own family members so he could eat them all by himself in secret. Furthermore, she had seen Jitsu sniffing around her younger cousin, and that had really turned her blood cold. She told me that generations of her kind had learnt not to trust people, for in their minds they hid too many secrets from each other, which meant they couldn't be trusted. She did believe some people were intrinsically good, and those were the kind that her people were inclined to help. She was surprised, though, that people weren't telepathic, but she said she thought it was a good thing that they weren't, as they might be horrified to learn what the other was really thinking about them. She did say that the advantages of being telepathic is that you could literally discern between a good heart and a rotten one at just a mere glance, for even the energy field surrounding a human would confirm to you what he was actually about. The red energy fields you needed to watch like a hawk, as those people were spiritually disconnected to the natural world, were impulsive, hot-headed, and exceedingly arrogant. She asked me in my mind why I was staying in the woods, and I told her all about my father, what he'd done to me. She was mortified, nonplussed, astounded. "He's got a black heart. He needs to be eliminated," she told me. "All rotten fruit needs throwing out, or it contaminates the barrel and spoils everything." It was in late summer, when my sister ventured into the woods to drop off some food for me, that I realised to my horror that she hadn't been as careful as she could have been, for she was not alone. Unbeknownst to her, my suspicious father had cottoned on to her frequent trips to the woods. and noticed that the food seemed to be leaping off the shelves of the pantry at an alarming rate. None of that had escaped his attention. He figured out my sister was hiding something, so surreptitiously followed her into the woods, shadowing her every move. "Now, isn't this very nice and cosy?" said my father, his gravelly voice booming from behind a tree. He walked brazenly forward, past my sister, facing me with indignant eyes as deadly as a black panther. "I might have known you were here. Now you get back home at once. You've got some explaining to do, young man. You've been gone for a very long time." "He's not coming home, Dad," my sister had piped. "Otherwise we'll both go to the police. We'll tell them everything you did. They'll lock you up for 100 years, throw away the key. You'll get exactly what's coming to you." As this was all transpiring, I could see Kamara watching me from the tree line. We'd recently only just shared a couple of sandwiches together. I'm in no doubt she could read my discomposed body language and discern the terror in my eyes as my father grabbed me by the back of my neck collar, pushing me fiercely down the path. "You come home now." Kamara grabbed my father around the waist, turning him upside down so his head dangled only yards above the ground. She whacked his head against a tree so hard that his head almost flew off the neck. I knew at once that he was dead. I wish I could say I felt regret or sadness, but I just felt relief, the kind of relief you get when you swat a blood-sucking leech off your skin. Kamara looked at me sadly. Her warm eyes told me, "He was a bad apple. He needed to go. I need to go also, for your kind will be sniffing around here sooner or later, so I need to get out of here fast. I need to return home. It's possibly time I did anyway, but I've enjoyed knowing you." She looked at me and said, "I love you, Carlton. Your heart is mine forever. You'll be my friend for lifetimes to come, for our life paths are definitely interlinked. Know this, young man. Whenever you see me in your mind's eye, trust the image you see. Know that I've popped in to say hello. Know that I've popped in to send you my love. I will always be there with you, forever and ever, even if we never lay eyes on each other again in this lifetime. Remember, I will never, ever leave your side." To cut a long story short, I lived the rest of my youth with my sister Irma, being raised by my mother, who to this day has never admitted to my father's predatory nature, but I know she knew about it. Me and Irma never regretted Kamara eliminating my father from our lives, as he really was a bad apple. My father's body was found in the woods deceased. It was believed he was attacked by a bear. For many years I never told people the truth about what happened to him. I never will. In this anomalous forum, why not? I just want people to know that before you judge a predatory territorial Bigfoot so stiffly, there are human predators, hundreds and hundreds of them out there, preying on young children, like my father preyed on me. In my book, the human predator can be the worst kind of all. As for Kamara, I miss her terribly. She is one of the most awesome beings I've ever been privileged enough to know. She was very human. I feel honoured that she touched my life so richly. As she promised, she still pops into my mind at least twice a day. I know it's her checking in on me. So there you are. That's my story. Wow! What an incredible story. And certainly we do know that there are human monsters out there, and Kamara was right about him. He was a nasty piece of work.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Roland sighed in disbelief. The heavy sigh travelled from his mouth, down his esophagus into his stomach cavity, where a series of strange gaseous exchanges like nothing he'd ever experienced before appeared to be taking place. He was privately hoping his wife had not heard the squirming sound of his stomach, that wasn't expressing hunger at all, but abject horror at what he was seeing with his naked eye. No wonder they say we feel our emotions in our belly, he thought. In this moment, the emotional feedback he was getting from the house that he'd come to see, courtesy of his wife, was instinctively guttural, almost as if he sensed at once that something was terribly wrong with this place. It was almost as if sinister secrets lurked between the foundations of the house, and were festering in the walls like a crawling parasitic mould. He didn't like the ambience of this house one bit. It screamed sorrow and heartbreak, that drilled into his soul like a jackhammer drill, sending prickles of dread coursing down his spine. He wondered how he was supposed to react to this property.
By all intents and purposes, he was an easygoing man that didn't allow much to irk him. He wore his heart on his sleeves. This opprobrious mansion represented the kind of sinister abode you'd likely see on a gruesome Stephen King movie. The kind of bodefully oppressive house where all the guests would arrive at the dead of night, be greeted by the sinister caretaker with hollow eyes and a gormless grin, who looks half dead, welcoming you into the jaundiced bowels of the place with a raspy voice, accompanied by a wicked twinkle in his eyes, that suggests that he knows that he's leading you into an insidious trap. And after a night of terror spent in that house, you and the guests would never be seen again, as if in some way the malevolent evil in the house had swallowed the people whole, like a Bermuda Triangle of sorts. He couldn't imagine raising a family in a foreboding mansion like this. Was his wife pulling his strings? The house seemed wrapped up in a tight, clawing, menacing veil, as if even the sunlight had been thwarted from shining down on it. Of course, that could be explained by the lofty trees fringing the house on every side, that looked like monsters with grotesque gnarled limbs. This was the kind of place he was most sure his own children's friends would one day refuse to visit, fearing that the house was haunted by the spirits of the undead. Indeed, if he were a boy again, he would almost certainly avoid staying in a place like this. He could almost imagine lying awake at night, jumping at any sounds, any bang or creak that you might hear in the house, even if it were benign. The worst part of it all was old houses were notorious for having old crotchety bones, so that the staircases creaked and groaned, and the plumbing lightly banged and clattered if a tap was put on in an upstairs bathroom or down in the kitchen. And those ominous clawing sounds would bring life to your nightmares, like a flame to a firework. Was this some kind of joke, he thought? Pray God this was a joke. He allowed himself to cling on to this lost hope that it was, but his wife's face did not look like that of a woman who was about to tell him, "Only joking! As if I'd ever buy a place like this, Roland! You've got to be kidding me! If you must know, it's a haunted location. I thought I'd bring you here for a wind-up, so that for a moment you would really believe we would be shortly moving into this place." Alas, Roland knew that this was no joke on his wife's part. She was deadly serious about this place. "You've got to be kidding." Her besotted expression told him all he needed to know. Had his wife really just purchased this place off the cuff like this for the both of them to live in? He could not see this as a place where you would lay down happy memories and comfortably spread out your roots. It was like a nauseating bad dream that he hoped he'd wake up from. But this was no dream. He was staring at a mansion in complete bewilderment, one that his wife had fully intended to buy. The house brooded there miserably on its sturdy foundations, almost as if basking in its lugubrious melancholia, that was so tangibly felt that it chilled Roland to the core of his bones. Something really bad had happened here. Of that he was in absolutely no doubt. And yet his wife seemed blindly immune to the negative energy that the house exuded. It was like she was completely mesmerized by the place, locked under some kind of hypnotic enchanted spell. Could she really not see how dark and austere the house appeared? Granted, it may have looked prepossessing at one point in time, but now it was anything but alluring. It boasted a dark black pitched roof, wrap-around front porches, cylindrical turrets and roof towers, and was built on a sizable woodland property in the Colorado countryside, surrounded by lofty wood groves of very ancient trees that were as old as the house itself. And the countryside was sequestered. It had been left to become wild and untamed, as if the abandoned property had been deserted for a very long time. The windows of the house were riddled with damp and decay, crumbling in their dilapidation, crying out for someone to restore them back to their former glory, like a battle-weary soldier that had been badly injured and needed someone to attend to his wounds. Everywhere you looked, You would see dust, silvery cobwebs that made their home on the outside windows, and rust was bleeding all over the walls of the house and between the surface cracks. Worse still, there was ugly burgeoning creepers growing wildly over the walls, confiscating its beauty by swathing it in a rambunctious tangle of ugly green tentacles, which made it appear all the more glibly menacing. Roland clandestinely suspected that some of this frightfully abhorrent creeper had lightly bludgeoned through the cracks of the ceilings of the house by now, and was crawling along the inside walls. Worse still, the front yard that at one time probably looked spectacularly inviting was now hideously overgrown, with unsightly innocuous weeds and thorny briars, with appendages so sharp they could tear you apart. It was clear to see that where flower beds once proudly stood, showing off a fabulous bouquet of attractive plants, was now just a tangle of hideous weeds and aggressively dominant rambling creepers that stole the space in a haphazard chaos. The house stank of the melancholic abandoned energy of neglect, like something ancient that you find buried in the attic, that's been there for centuries, and you pull it out from among the clutter, and it looks like it's beyond salvaging. Who in their right mind bought a property like this? It was like adopting a badly abused child from an orphanage and trying to invest in something that was so damaged it was beyond help. And even if this old Victorian was restored to its former glory, it did not change the fact that it would do little to erase the darkness, the sombre energy that the house exuded, like a silent, unwelcome message telling you to go away. Roland would be happy to have done just that. Ostensibly, the house his wife has chosen to call the Grey Lady was much like a woman in mourning, who had spent her tragic life wearing the dark clothes of her lamentations. Roland remembered a time when his own grandmother had taken him for tea at her best friend's house, Mrs. Dorothy Pender. The house he had been invited to was a 1950s semi-detached property, which Mrs. Dorothy Pender had just purchased at the time. He recalled how he had been hit with a profound sense of foreboding and an uneasiness that he could not shake off. He had wondered, at such a young, impressionable age, how a house could make him feel like this. The moment he'd entered the property, he'd wanted to leave almost immediately. Later, Roland was to discover from his grandmother Violet, when he told her about the incomprehensible bad vibes he'd experienced at the house while they'd enjoyed tea together, that someone had been murdered in that property. It would seem the previous owner of Mrs. Pender's new house had been shot dead at point-blank range by his own wife, in order for her to gain his life insurance policy. Roland had picked up the macabre energy of the place. His grandmother told him that Dorothy Pender had purchased it for a steal from the estate agents, as naturally no one wanted to live there, in a place clouded by so much tragedy. But Dorothy had had her eye on a bargain, had not been remotely worried about buying the house, if it meant she got it for such a bargain.
You know what people are like, Violet, dear. Oh, they are so overreactive over everything, she'd said to his grandmother. And, of course, so darn superstitious, if you ask me. So what? Someone was murdered here. Big deal. But the room where it has happened is completely gutted. I don't believe in houses being haunted. That's complete baloney, if you ask me. I'm just lucky that I benefited from people's superstitions. I got the place for practically nothing. What happened here doesn't bother me at all, because it's no longer around. That energy has obviously lifted a long time ago. Well, rather you than me, Roland's grandmother had told Dorothy, in no uncertain terms. I couldn't do it myself. Live in a house where someone was murdered. It's just something I wouldn't be able to get my head around, I'm afraid. In my opinion, they should bulldoze places like this, bring them down to the ground, obliterate the bad memories, rebuild again, one brick at a time. Mrs. Pender had made an amused face and chuckled. Violet, you are such a darn drama queen. You really are. It's just bricks and mortar, for goodness sake. The house is not going to harm me, and there are no ghosts in this place. I can assure you of that." Those were Dorothy Pender's famous last words, as within 12 months of purchasing the property, she had died in unusual idiosyncratic circumstances that was put down to being accidental by the coroner, who suggested she'd taken a nasty tumble down the staircase. Roland thought there was something bad in that house, as even shortly after moving to the place, Mrs. Pender seemed to complain tirelessly of terrible migraine headaches and feelings of nausea that came upon her very suddenly. When Dorothy Pender had died, Roland's grandmother had confessed to him, through teary eyes, "That house killed my dear friend. I know it did. The moment she moved into that place, her life went downhill very fast, as if she was standing on quicksand. My friend lost her joy almost at once. I tried to persuade her that the house was, of course, the source of all her problems, but she refused to believe it. You know how mulishly stubborn she was. Let that be a lesson to you, Roland dear. Never ever buy a property with bad energy like that. I promise you, houses are like sponges. They absorb energy, and if you're not careful, that contagious energy can drag you down. That's what I believe happened to poor old Dorothy. I'm most sure. I don't believe her fall down the staircase was an accident. Something was in that house. Unfortunately, Dorothy had one Achilles heel. She just loved a bargain, didn't she? She couldn't help herself. Do you know, I remember on one occasion, when she invited me to tea, she proudly announced that the brownies we were eating she had hoisted out of a dumpster outside a bakery. I was appalled. I couldn't believe it, Roland. I went home and heaved up the contents of my stomach. Let me tell you, after hearing that, every time I go to Dorothy's, well, every time I went to Dorothy's for tea, I always made sure that whatever it is she served me up was not something she'd got out of a dumpster. Dorothy Pender had a lot of money, you know, Roland, but she was tight about spending it. And now her love for a bargain has sent her to an early grave, and in my book, that's too high a price to pay."
"Don't worry, Grandma," he had assured his grandmother. "When I'm older, I'll only live in happy places. I'll never, ever, ever live in a place like Dorothy Pender's. I could never move into a house like hers." As Roland stared at the Victorian house his wife had purchased, he felt nauseously sick, as if he wanted to throw up. He knew if Grandma Violet could see this place, she'd be turning in her grave, screaming at him to run away from this place faster than a March hare. Roland tried to compose himself. He straightened out his 6'8" tall, lanky frame, to steady himself, and to hold back the guttural distaste of what he was observing, as if trying to suppress the tickle of a sneeze. Never in a million months of Sundays had he expected this, but then he was still learning about his wife, and he had a lifetime to explore her personality, like an uncharted treasure map, and he was looking forward to their journey together as man and wife, which he believed would be an exciting one at that. But Roland knew there were some roller coasters at the fairground you would do well to avoid getting on. Some of his friends at the office had warned him to take it slow when it came to getting married. "How can you marry a woman you've only known for 4 months, Roland?" his business partner Maxwell had told him. "I dated my wife for 8 years before we got hitched." "I don't know," Roland had said, "but when I met Lizelle, I knew she was the one for me. I was mesmerized by her from the word go." "I don't like the sound of that, Roland," said Maxwell scathingly. "Listen to yourself more closely. You're using a word like mesmerized to describe your wife, like a spell thrust upon you from a Harry Potter novel. That's like being so beguiled by someone that you're not really thinking straight when you're making that kind of a commitment.
You should always make any lifelong decision with a clear head and your feet on solid ground. I heard somewhere that people who marry their best friends have marriages that last for a lifetime. My wife is my best friend. When it comes to Lizelle, what do you actually know about her, really?" he had said. "I know enough," Roland had said adamantly, "to know that I want to spend my life with her." Maxwell had frowned and looked at his friend obsequiously. "You know what, Roland? You and me, we go back a long time, do we not? You're like a brother to me, not just a best friend. So I would say don't take marriage too lightly. Look at the divorce rates out there these days. They're through the roof. Don't run into something, my friend, before you can walk. That's all I'm saying." Roland was quietly realizing that there were indeed things about his wife he did not know. I mean, if he had known she'd buy a house like this, he would have insisted in having a say on the matter. He had been so sure she'd have chosen a normal house, within the boundaries of what he would consider acceptable. But this outlandish mansion was way off the mark for him, and there was nothing remotely normal about it. If you were buying a haunted location for guests hungry for paranormal experiences and with a desire to be scared out of their wits, investors would be clever to buy a place like this. But to buy a place like this to live in as a family home, Roland would be laughing if it wasn't so damn tragic. As for that wood grove, with the tall gnarled trees that looked like menacious monsters, the property appeared insidiously menacing and very unwelcoming as far as Roland was concerned. He had married his wife Lizelle after a passionate 4-month love affair when he met her on an ocean liner. He felt as if he'd won the lottery, he was so happy. Lizelle looked animated as she stared at the house that she had bought. She had brought Roland along to see it, with a blindfold on him, before she drove him up to the house in her SUV. He had guessed the house was situated in a rather remote area, as the truck his wife had been driving had been precariously bumping over jolts and crevices in the road. "You're going to love the house, Roland," she told him, with great conviction in her voice. "And wait until I tell you the stories connected to the place. It'll keep you awake at night, it will. Put it this way, it's almost like we're going to be living in our own fairy tale castle." Roland had chuckled. "Why don't I like the sound of this, Lizelle?" said Roland uneasily. "You're making me rather nervous. What on earth have you bought for us?" "If you're worried about the money, Roland, there's no need to be. Hold your horses. The house I've chosen for us is well within the budget you gave me. I was able to buy the place at a bargain. Moreover, the structural engineer has assured me that although the house is run down and unkept, it is built on solid foundations and is structurally very sound. They don't make houses like this today. That's why properties like this are a sound investment. Well, that's what he told me anyway. And although I agree, I'm no expert on properties, I will admit that. But you can see the house has strong bones at one glance. I'm sure you will realize that." When Roland had heard the house was old, that his wife had purchased, he suspected it was a ranch-style property and needed a little tender loving care. But he had never envisaged his wife buying an old Victorian mansion that needed gutting on the inside. He was sure he'd be a long time before he and his wife could actually move into the place. This old mansion needed more than just a facelift. It probably needed a Catholic exorcist to cast out the foreboding gloom that hung around the place like a suffocating choker chain of pearls around a lady's neck. Lizelle had parked the truck on the overgrown driveway, opened up the passenger side door, and led out her blindfolded husband by the hand over some bumpy crevices in the ground, and then released the blindfold from his eyes as Roland had stood there stupefied as he gawked at the house with a gobsmacked expression on his face. "Look at you!" Lizelle had giggled. "You look so shocked, Roland." "I know. Isn't it absolutely marvellous? Have you ever seen anything quite so spectacular? It's probably taken your breath right away, as it did mine, when I first laid my eyes on it. I can hardly believe this house is ours, and I found it for us. I feel as if I've won the lottery, like when I met you, Roland. Isn't it absolutely gorgeous." Lizelle's eyes were burning brightly, with an irrepressible ebullient enthusiasm. She almost danced in front of the grey lady, delighting in showing Roland their brand new home. Indeed, she was so spirited, so chuffed, so abounding with a bountiful joy, like a kid in a candy shop, riveted by all the yummy sweets on display. Roland knew he'd feel like a prize prat if he was to rob his wife of her obvious joy by being such a killjoy, and expressing his extreme misgivings about the property that his wife had not only chosen, but bought with his consent. How could he complain about the place when he had gladly given his wife carte blanche to buy the property she liked for the both of them? "Really," she'd said to him at the time, "you're going to let me choose where we live? Buy the house of my dreams, even if you don't see it? Why would you do that, Roland?" Roland had reached out to take his wife's hand. "Because I love the bones of you, Lizelle. I want to make you deliriously happy if I can. And it's a privilege as your husband to give my wife her heart's desires, if of course it is within my grasp to be able to do so. Everybody knows in relationships we have to make sacrifices in order to make each other happy. I know you will choose the quintessential perfect place for us to raise a family together. So the decision about what house you buy is entirely your decision. Besides, I'd like to be surprised when I sign the legal documents for the property. I enjoy being surprised. In truth, I'm indifferent about where we actually live. As long as I'm with you, that's all that matters. That is what will make me happy." Lizelle had looked at her husband adoringly, with her warm eyes the colour of honeyed treacle, and said, "Where did I find you, Roland Peterson? I knew when I first laid eyes on you that you were a keeper." Roland had chuckled and said, "It's no big deal. Where we live, that's not a problem for me. As I said, I'm leaving the decisions to you. Everything is in your hands. Besides, house hunting is a pretty boring thing to do, when there are a lot more interesting things to be doing with my time. I've also got a lot of deadlines to meet at my offices in Denver. And besides, I am in no doubt you have great taste." When Roland had said that to his wife, could he really say she had great taste, when he didn't really know her that well? But if this house was anything to go by, taste she clearly had not. He had envisaged something so different to this, when he'd been signing the deeds for the property with his wife. Before seeing it for himself, he had trusted her so much to make a savvy choice. But this house looked like something the bowels of the earth had purged up, like a deadly toxic mushroom that needed to be bulldozed at once. "Roland, you've been awfully quiet since we got here. You haven't answered my question yet. What do you think about the grey lady?" asked Lizelle, her eyes shining brightly. "Isn't she wonderful? Absolutely wonderful. They called the house the Grey House, but I changed it to the Grey Lady. It's so much more apt. She's so beautiful, isn't she? Have you ever seen anything so charmed in your entire life?" Roland could think of a whole lot of things more significantly beautiful than this dingy, grandiose old Victorian mansion. Roland blinked and inwardly grimaced as he awkwardly chewed his lip, trying his level best to hide his extreme displeasure from his wife. Did his wife seriously expect them to live here? The place was as oppressive as a mortuary. It almost looked anorexic and emaciated from the wear and tear of time, which gave the grey lady a skeletal, rather beleaguered look, as if she had no meat on her bones. It had not escaped his attention that the wood on the wraparound porch was so warped it had rotted all away. "You're still in shock, aren't you?" Lizelle giggled. "Bless you, Roland. I can see you're as thrilled as I am. When the estate agent took me here to the Grey Lady, I passed out on the spot. I was so enamoured with the place. The poor man, he had to run in the house to get me some water. He kept asking me if I was all right. I said to him, 'All right, all right. You don't understand. I've just died and gone to heaven. Of course I'm all right. This place is amazing.' 'I mean, yes, it needs a lot of work,' said Lizelle, giggling, 'but I'm prepared to put in all the tender, loving care into the place to bring the Grey Lady back to shape. It's so sad the place has been so neglected for so long. But that's all about to change. The old girl is about to have a makeover that will turn her into a goddess. I cannot believe anyone would abandon a place like this. Do you know, no one has touched this place in years. It's been on the market at the estate agents, I'm told, for over 20 years. And there's been no buyers to date until now, until I came along. It seems we are the only people that can see the potential in this place. It oozes opportunity that others have failed to see. But their loss is our gain. Roland cleared his throat.
Why has it been on the market for so long? He asked. Did the estate agents say why it wasn't selling? I always thought old Victorian properties were highly sought after. And if this house really got the thumbs up from the structural engineer, why did it not sell? You would think some fixer-up would have invested in this place a long time ago, to sell for a sizable profit, would you not?
I know! It's crazy, isn't it? Completely nonsensical, said Lizelle impassionately. What's wrong with people? This place should have been swept up the moment it came on the market. The estate agent practically fainted when I told him I wanted to buy the house. He thought I'd be put off by the history. I mean, really, as if I would be.
Roland interjected very swiftly before his wife had time to finish her sentence.
What did the estate agent tell you about the history of this house? He asked,
sensing that the history might explain the disagreeable energy of the home.
Oh, didn't I say? Said Lizelle nonchalantly. Well, apparently in the 1800s, the owner of this house, a man called Oliver Bennett, claimed his wife Eleanor Bennett had gone missing. She went into the woods on this property one day and never returned home. The owner claimed there was a monster in the woods that had taken his wife away. He said he'd seen the monster himself before and had tried to chase it off the property a few times by firing after it. It would seem it wasn't remotely intimidated by his shotgun, and his bullets kept missing the target every time. The monster kept coming back to the property like a dog to its vomit. He said the creature was demoniacal, with red eyes, standing up on 2 feet like a man. His wife claimed that she had been stalked by the creature, which she described was a wolf-like humanoid. On many occasions she told her husband she had noticed the creature staring at her from the trees. She believed the creature was after her, but Mr. Bennett told her that as scary as the creature was, if it did intend to harm her, it would have done so a long time ago. She didn't agree, of course. She said, "But you don't understand. He's biding his time, I know he is, but he wants me," she told him. "I know he does. I feel it in my bones. He'll grab me when the time is right. I know he will, and you'll never ever see me again. You have to kill him, Oliver, or this thing will get me."
"I'll do my level best to kill him for you," her husband had told her.
But every time he tried to fire, the thing fled like the wind. He tried to persuade his wife that her worries were unfounded, even though the creature was incredibly intimidating.
"But what if it's a demon?" his wife had asked him. "That might be the reason you can't kill it, Oliver. Your bullets keep missing their target. You're a great shot normally, Oliver. It makes no sense to me that you cannot take this insidious beast down."
"It's not a demon," Oliver assured his wife. "But I will admit, whatever it is not of this world. I've never seen anything like it."
On the day that his wife mysteriously vanished, Oliver noticed the creature's tracks in the ground, as after the recent rainfall to the area, the imprints of a gargantuan-sized wolf-like humanoid were clear to be seen. Oliver Bennett knew without a shadow of a doubt that this insidious beast had been responsible for abducting his wife, who was nowhere to be found. But the police were called on the scene to search for her anyway, but no trace of her could be recovered. Mr. Bennett showed them the huge wolf-like tracks in the ground that seemed to belong to a very sizable animal, walking upright on 2 feet, which astounded the police investigators, who only had one word to say on the matter: "What the hell?" They could not make sense of the enigmatic imprints, but they assumed that Oliver Bennett's wife had been savagely attacked by a wild animal, and that was the end of the matter. The bereaved Oliver Bennett was so incredibly devastated about his wife's disappearance. He spent years in the woodgrove, on the property of the Grey Lady, hunting for the creature everywhere, but it eluded him all the time.
He'd find the creature's imprints in the ground, sense he was being watched, see a flash of red eyes in his peripheral vision, smell the repugnant stench of death and decay that he knew belonged to the wolf-like beast, the smell that made you want to heave up the contents of your stomach and cause your eyes to physically burn, as if you'd had acid flung at your face. Mr. Bennet was never able to find the creature. He was certain the enigmatic, mysterious beast was feeding off his anger, enjoying his grief, like you might luxuriate in a hot bubble bath. It was an impression he got, as whenever he returned to the house after searching for the creature, the following day he could not get out of bed. He was so emotionally spent. It was like all his energy had been sucked out of him, like the milkshake from a straw. His health soon declined after the exhaustion ensued. It would seem Oliver Bennet tragically died with a broken heart. In this house, the Grey Lady, devastated that he could not right the wrong by killing the elusive wolf-like humanoid that he knew literally had killed and abducted his own wife. Oliver Bennet had one daughter and a son, both affirming that they both had witnessed the monster, who was fixated over their mother for reasons unknown. There was a write-up in the paper about it at the time, with a title which read, "Colorado man Oliver Bennet believes his wife Eleanor Bennet was abducted and lightly killed by a wolf-like humanoid, a bipedal standing on 2 feet, that had been stalking for her for a very long time, watching her from the woods on their property, smelling as repugnant as a decomposing corpse. Mr. Bennet told the paper that the whole family, including his son Earl and his daughter Charlotte, had seen the intimidating beast with their very own eyes. They claimed the creature stood up on 2 legs at 8 foot tall, was thin and emaciated, with ribs sticking out from the torso, and patches of mange dispersed over its cropped brown short hair. For a while we thought the creature was a demon," they told the paper, "but I assure you it was real." Charlotte got a close-up view of the creature, described it as almost mocking her. "It was laughing at me. I know it was. It had so much drool, dribbling down its jaws, and 2 rows of jagged canine teeth. When it saw me, it began thrashing its tail like an agitated dog. I was so terrified," she explained. "I ran away from the thing, screaming my lungs out to full capacity, but it never gave me chase. When I looked back over my shoulders, it was just standing where I last saw it, staring at me. And as crazy as this may sound, it really did seem to be laughing at me. I knew it was enjoying putting the fear of God into my soul." Mr. Oliver Bennet went on to say, "I have even found places in the woodgrove where the thing has been nesting among the carcasses of wild animals, and it smells so foul, like nothing on this earth. I have tried to kill the beast. It has eluded me every time, for it seems to pirouette away from my bullets, moving faster than the wind in its escape. Believe me, there are things out there that defy man's grasp and understanding, but I've seen these things myself. I can affirm to the doubting Thomases out there, and to the disbelievers, that monsters do indeed exist. They are not fables conjured up by mythical stories told to us by our grandparents, passed down through the generations as fireside stories or fables. They are, in my humble opinion, based on hardened facts, where hunters from the past, sometimes on their solo journeys in the wilderness, encountered seemingly mythical beasts in the wooded labyrinths of Colorado, for we have heard many stories of these accounts. As to what this mythical beast is, I cannot say, but it takes the words ugly and grotesque to a whole new level, for nothing in my ability to describe this demonical beast would do it justice. I have retired from my pursuit of this thing, as it delights in my inability to catch it. It feeds off my energy like a succubus, to such an extent that for days afterwards I am so fatigued I can barely keep my eyes open." Roland Peterson's eyes grew round as he listened to what his wife had to tell him. It was sobering. His breathing became quite heavy with her words. It certainly explained why the Grey Lady possessed such a depressed, inauspicious energy. He wondered if it could be that the sorrowful tragedy concerning Oliver Bennet had somehow been soaked up by the house like a sponge. It was more than likely. He looked at Lizelle with a confounded expression on his face. "You're telling me the estate agent told you all this concerning the property?" he asked. "I'm surprised he'd tell you so much, if he was eager for a sale, and could see you were keen on the house. It's hardly a good sales technique, is it, to tell you about the house's dark history?"
"I expect he didn't have much choice in the matter," she said. "I think it's somewhere in their code of ethics, isn't it? Even if it is an urban legend, to tell me all the stories connected to the house. Let's just say he did better than that," she said proudly. "He showed me the newspaper article written about the case in the 1800s. It was fascinating. I mean, it seems so far-fetched and ludicrous, does it not? But it was there. It was there in black and white, Roland, to read. Said we'd seen the family, the Bennet family, that is, were terrorized by something despicable. But that's not all to my story."
"There's more?"
asked Roland, looking as if he was about to choke on a piece of invisible coal stuck at the back of his throat. He didn't like the sound of more.
"Of course there's more, you nincompoop," said Lizelle, laughing in delight. "Don't you just love stories like this? They keep you second-guessing, wondering what really goes on in this world of ours. Some people may say it's all woo-woo, but I've got an open mind about these things. My dad used to say that not everything is simply just black and white, and that there is one certainty in life, and that we're certain not to know it all."
"Well, that's an interesting way to put it," said Roland reflectively. "And of course your father was absolutely right."
Roland thought that the story concerning the Grey Lady, the house that they had purchased, even if it had happened a long time ago, certainly tugged at his discomfort about the place all the more. It was true that Mr. Bennet had felt desolate after losing his wife to this dreadful wolf-like humanoid. He wondered if the Victorian house was carrying all the family's grief, like a bride holding on to her bouquet, refusing to let it go. Lizette, seeing that she had her husband's undivided attention, continued,
"Well, more recently, about 50 years ago, the Grey Lady was purchased by a man called Edmund Sinclair and his wife Molly. They both fell passionately in love with the property. And I mean, who can blame them? Imagine how spectacular it was back in the day. They bought it at once. Now, Edmund's a pretty old-fashioned name, don't you think? I actually like the name a lot. They should use it more these days. Maybe if we have a boy, Roland, we should call it Edmund one day. I kind of like it. Well, the couple, they had 4 children. 3 of them who claimed to have seen a wolf-like humanoid on this very property, lurking in the woods, watching them when they were playing games out of doors. Can you believe that? Mr. Sinclair thought they'd heard the legend concerning his house in the 1800s and were making up fictitious stories to validate the claims made by Oliver Bennet, so that they could spin some kind of sensational yarn to all their friends back at school, and subsequently perpetuate the urban legend. One day Edmund Sinclair's wife vanished, in exactly the same way that Eleanor Bennet had done in the 1800s. The children had heard the couple have a disagreement during the evening, but they soon made up, and then went to bed. The following morning, after Edmund's wife had risen early, before anybody else in the house, she was never ever seen again after that. It was believed animal imprints, similar to those found by Mr. Oliver Bennet in the 1800s, were found by Edmund Sinclair in the woodgrove. The entire grove stank of death and decay. He said it smelt so vile, like a decomposing corpse, only worse. But he could not locate the mysterious source of the smell. The police were naturally called on the scene to search for Molly. They could make no sense of the enigmatic large wolf-like prints in the grove that were clearly made by a bipedal creature standing upright on 2 legs. But what it was, no one knew. The disgusting smell that awaited them in the grove was said to have caused those investigating the incident to have lucid nightmares for many days after the event. They searched the entire grove for the whereabouts of Molly, but she was never ever found.
The officers were completely stumped to find her sneakers that she'd been wearing that morning, tied up on a tree, as if they'd been deliberately placed there, almost to taunt them. Well, that's what they felt anyway. Mr. Sinclair said that his wife would never ever have removed her sneakers like that. So what on earth were they doing as a pair tied together on the tree by their laces, hanging from the branches like a pair of dangling Christmas decorations? It certainly appeared to be a message of some kind. During the whole search, the officers claimed something evil, very malevolent, had been watching them, although they physically saw nothing. They believed that Edmund's wife had come to a tragic, fortuitous end at the hands of a dangerous, deadly predator, the likes of such they'd never seen before. One of the children told the police she had heard her mother crying out in the early hours of the morning. She had been upstairs at the time, fast asleep, and had woken up in a daze, glancing briefly out of the window to see what she described as the scariest, most horrible monster she'd ever seen in her entire life, standing up on two legs with a human-like stature, but the face of a wolf. She had seen her mother being flung onto the creature's back, and sensing it had an audience, it had looked up at her at the window and appeared to be smiling at her, while globlets of drool spilled down its jaws. She said her mother's frantic cries scared the bejesus out of her, and she quickly returned to bed, persuading herself it had all been a horrible nightmare, and in the morning she'd realised that she had imagined the whole thing. But she soon realised, after the prints were recovered in the grove by the police, that her nightmare had in fact been real. To all intents and purposes, the family remained at the Grey Lady, and much like Oliver Bennet had done in the 18th century, Edmund Sinclair was filled with furious rage towards the mysterious wolf-like humanoid. He tried to locate the creature, but to no avail. He even organised a team of hunters, along with their sniffer dogs, to try and locate the creature's whereabouts so that they could ultimately kill him. It would seem some of the sniffer dogs became too afraid to go into the woodgrove and began to cower, so their handlers took them home. The hunters all felt a sense of grave foreboding as they searched the grove for any signs of the mysterious beast. Most believed they were being watched and stalked by something the whole time. Some felt incredibly threatened by an ominous sense of foreboding that they refused to continue searching the grove. Their advice to Mr. Edmund Sinclair was to get the hell out of this place, to leave the Grey Lady. But Edmund Sinclair tirelessly spent many restless years hoping to locate the beast that had abducted and killed his wife. He believed the creature was there in the grove somewhere, but he and his children never ever saw it again.
You mean to tell me, Lizelle, that the estate agent tells you all this about the property concerning its history? Said Roland, unable to hide the confoundment that had disturbed the features on his face. Yet you still wanted to buy this property from him. He must have thought his Christmases had all come at once. He's been trying to sell this place for 20 years, and then you come along.
Lizelle laughed.
Yes, he did. He said to me, "Are you sure you want this place, after everything I've told you?" I mean, as if I'm going to be concerned about a wolf-like humanoid coming after us. I'm not stupid. And if the story has put off other people buying this place, all well and good, she laughed. Their loss is our gain, Roland.
Roland's wife's words made him feel sick to the core of his stomach. He had heard those words being spoken before, by Dorothy Pender, when she'd purchased a house with such a negative history, and a year later she was dead.
Look, Lizelle, said Roland uncomfortably. Are you sure you want this house?
Lizelle looked at Roland in astonishment.
Of course I'm sure. Anyway, it's a bit late to change my mind, isn't it? I've already purchased the place for the both of us. Don't be intimidated, Roland, about all the work. I've got a good team working on the place. Before long we'll be moving into the Grey Lady. I don't know about you, but I can barely wait.
Roland's heart sank. He certainly did not have the heart or the will to tell Lizelle that moving into the Grey Lady was something that he'd very much like to postpone for as long as possible. Indeed, he'd like to put the house straight back on the market and try to sell it for another 20 years. But he knew that that was not a solution to their problem. He abhorred the place. He hated it with every single fibre in his being. But he couldn't tell Lizelle that. She was so in love with the property. He could only hope with the renovations the house might lose some of its heaviness. But he was very doubtful that it actually would. Paul Benelodge's account. My name is Paul Benelodge. I've been working on historic homes for over 20 years or so, with my constructing team, bringing the houses of history back into shape, so they look like they did when they were first constructed, so that if you didn't know any better, you'd likely believe we had dragged the house kicking and screaming from the 18th century into the modern-day 21st century. You have to have an expert knowledge in the history of old houses, which is my speciality, of course, and I'm very good at working on Victorian properties most especially, bringing this extraordinary metamorphosis about. It's rather like being a reconstructive surgeon, I suspect, in a manner of speaking, but in the construction business, bringing to life the bones of a house that has become emaciated, battle-weary, from the erosion of time. I get a remarkable great sense of satisfaction working on these precious gems from our past, making them bloom again. I assure you, over 20 years on working in historic homes, me and my team have experienced strange phenomenon from time to time that can only be described as not of this world, as sometimes as we're working on houses where old memories contained within the walls are being played back in our time-space. We have heard disembodied voices, smelt strange, peculiar smells, sometimes even been physically touched, or had strange encounters with people that we realize later must have actually been a ghost, for they just disappeared in front of us, like a wisp of smoke. This has happened more times than I actually care to count. Ostensibly, it is not terribly unusual for us to experience something when we're busy working on an old property, as our activities often stir up strange phenomena that we cannot explain, but it usually goes away once we've completed the job. Working together with my team, I've seen some bizarre, rather idiosyncratic things over the years. But then again, you do have to remember, when you're buying an old house where people have lived and died and played out their lives, it would seem an energy reservoir is almost certainly left behind. Which is why, of course, you find old houses have so much character, charm, great personality. If you look at a new, more modern property, for example, where no one has ever lived in it before, you will find the energy is flat, benign, relatively nondescript, so to speak. It's rather like looking at a blank canvas on the wall, that the artist has not brought to life with his expression, using the medium of paint. Or again, like staring at a brand new fish tank that has not developed a natural ecosystem yet. There is no doubt in my mind that you can feel the vacuousness of such a space that has been untampered with, rather like an unfurnished room that badly needs to be decorated. Someone invariably has to move into the property to bring some energy and life into the place. I believe magnificent houses from our past that have been happily and well lived in have soaked up the energy of the previous residents that have resided within its depths, which in my humble opinion makes an old house infinitely more superior in the interests it obviously engenders. It is the difference between walking into a yard that has only just been planted up, with small trees and tiny little rose bushes, as opposed to walking into a fully established mature garden, where the old glorious trees stand tall and proud, with outstretched sculptural branches and large impressive trunks securely anchored to the ground. Then there are the shrubs, the bushes, the mature rose plants that are astoundingly beautiful, and over the years have gladly contributed to making the garden even more beguiling and prepossessing. It becomes like a well-developed coral reef that over time begins to become more and more magnificent, unless, of course, the beauty has been jeopardized by the damage we might inflict on it, which can cause a garden or a coral reef to unfortunately die. Getting back to the point of this story of mine, I'm in charge of a team of men whom I supervise in all manner of restoration projects when it comes to old houses. I like to take on any challenge, but the Grey Lady was one of the most intimidating ventures of my entire life. The moment I drove up the driveway to meet the new owner, a woman called Lizelle Peterson, I was struck by how ominous and foreboding the Grey Lady appeared. The house exuded what I can only describe as a sorrowful, mournful energy, almost as if the former residents of the property had impregnated the place with an all-encompassing grief, as if the foundations of the very house were basking in a brooding melancholia that it could not shake off, rather like the ticks on a dog's coat that have made their home happily in its hair and simply refuse to leave. The house was beautiful, of course, that was beyond doubt, although in a bad state of repair, needing quite a bit of work on it. Yet at the same time it was sinister and rather menacing, like the Ice Queen and Narnia in the children's book, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It had been abandoned by neglect, but even at a first glance I could see the place had great potential. It rested on good bones, which meant we could bring it back to shape. But the question on my mind was, would the dark energy actually shift? That I had to ask myself. But I was up to the challenge, as was my team of dedicated workers, who have not yet seen the house before I had, but I knew that they would be on board, as they were not intimidated by hard work of any kind.
"Oh, I'm so glad you came,"
Lizelle Peterson greeted me warmly, as I climbed out of my truck, standing anchored to the ground, that was cluttered with leaves and rambling ivy, as I stared at the Grey Lady, taking her all in, almost as if I was in an art gallery, getting the measure of her painting. Mrs. Peterson exuded enthusiasm and passion. I could see she had fallen in love with the Grey Lady, and believed that she could be restored to her former glory. And if she thought that the Grey Lady exuded a sorrowful, mournful energy, she expressed no such misgivings about the property, but only shared with me her bitter disappointment that her husband Roland Peterson clearly had not been enamoured by the house, and was privately aggrieved that Lizelle had bought the mansion. Lizelle Peterson was in her mid-30s, I suspect, an attractive woman with short-cropped hazelnut-highlighted hair and warm, lively brown eyes. The type of woman that you like at once. I knew she was a person who was her true, authentic self, not trying to be something she was not. And that, I have to say, is a quality I admire in people, as I do also in houses. She informed me that she'd met her husband Roland on a cruise liner. They'd fallen in love, and got married 4 months later, and as a consequence had ruffled more than a few feathers of both their families and friends, whom had tirelessly warned the couple that they were rushing things.
"When you know," she told me. "Lots of people weren't happy about us getting married so quickly. But we were of the opinion, why wait? We love each other. We want to be together forever. To hell with what others think." She laughed. "Anyway," she continued, "my husband Roland is a very good man, a man of integrity, a man of great charm. He cared about one thing, and that was making me happy and giving me my heart's desires. He said I could go and buy the house of my dreams to raise our family in, and that I had free rein to buy any place I liked for us, within a generous budget, of course. And I did just that. I didn't need much encouragement. And with a dogged determination, I went out house hunting. In truth, I had absolutely no idea what I was looking for until I laid eyes on the grey lady. I was like a kid in a candy store, I suspect. You see, no one in my entire life had said to me, "You choose, Lizelle." Growing up, I was the youngest of 8 children. My parents always made the decisions for my life. They decided where the family would ultimately go on our annual vacations. My mother chose my wardrobe, the schools and colleges I would frequent. But no one ever stopped to say to me, "Lizelle, you choose. You make the choice." When Roland said that I could choose the house we were to live in, I felt like a princess in charge of her own castle. I felt incredibly empowered. It was the most liberating feeling of my entire life. I was standing in the estate agent's window, and I saw a photograph of the grey lady on display. I had no idea it had been sitting there for over 20 long years, with no one showing even a fleeting interest in the place. I told the estate agent to take me to the property at once, and then I knew, in that second, the moment I laid eyes on it, that this house was for me. This house was for Roland and I to lay down roots. Unfortunately, I got a sense when I showed Roland the house. The feeling was not reciprocated. He wasn't enamoured or even best pleased with what I'd chosen for us. Bless his cotton socks, he tried to hide it well, of course, but I could tell he was thrown off his perch. He didn't expect me to choose a place like this, and I know he's bitterly disappointed. I think he thought I'd have bought some comfortable ranch-style house in the Colorado hills, in good condition, surrounded by pristine countryside, maybe a pond or lake, something like that. But all this, she said, throwing her arms towards the house, this he didn't expect. Instead, I brought him to an old house, shaded by trees, with a dark, gloomy ambience, and in a bad state of repair. And that did not go down terribly well. I cleared my throat and said, "Well, it isn't for anyone, is it? It must have been a shock for him when you brought him here, and he saw what a dreadful state the place was in. Anyone can see this property has been abandoned for many years. It must have been intimidating for your husband to see it like this." Lizelle raised a brow. "I thought he'd see beyond all this. I thought he was a visionary like myself and could see the potential of this place. But I think he thought I had dragged him along to his worst nightmare. He doesn't see through my eyes what this place could potentially become. When I told him about the history connected to the grey house, he didn't seem remotely amused about it. He said to me, 'You knew all this, and you still bought the place?' He couldn't make sense of that at all. He told me a few days later that his own grandmother had a friend called Dorothy Pender, who had bought a house once, where the owner had murdered her husband. You must forgive me, I don't know the macabre details of the story, and I don't want to either. But my husband visited that house as a boy, as he was invited there for tea with his grandmother Violet, at Dorothy Pender's house. At the time he didn't know what had happened at the property, but he found the energy nauseatingly unsettling and insufferable. So he confided in his grandmother about the foreboding energy he picked up of the house, and she told him about the murder that had taken place there. I gather a year after Mrs. Pender moved into that house, she died, in very mysterious circumstances. Apparently she took a tumble down the stairs. My husband's grandmother believed emphatically the house was responsible for Dorothy Pender's tragic fortuitous passing. He claimed that the moment she moved into the place, she was flooded with migraine headaches and nausea, and feeling increasingly unwell. Violet, of course, warned Dorothy to sell up the property at once and to leave the house, but Dorothy refused to listen. So that's what my husband told me.
And honestly, I think it was just an unfortunate accident. But my husband is reading so much into this all. I think he thinks the Grey Lady is as inauspicious as Dorothy Pender's house was back then. Although, of course, he didn't say as much in so many words. But it's ridiculous to think like he does, don't you think?
Well, it's not necessarily ridiculous. It's his opinion, is it not?
I said gingerly.
I mean, houses definitely have energy. The energy leaves an imprint on our time-space. If you're living in a property where something bad happened, that dark energy can affect you on an unconscious level, rather negatively, drag you down perhaps, influence you in some way, even impact your health. I know this from working on old places myself. Some places indeed have a benevolent energy, others not so much. It sounds nonsensical, I know, but energy is real. It's around us, it's everywhere, and in everything. And even inanimate objects like homes absorb energy. So, that's what I can say to you. There must have been a negative energy in Dorothy Pender's house. But whether it had anything to do with her accident, I have no idea.
I hadn't thought of it like that, said Lizelle. I think my husband feels the Grey Lady has a negative energy. He didn't say that straight to me, of course, but I'm not stupid. I mean, I can read between the lines, can't I? You should have seen his face when he saw it for the first time. He was mortified, absolutely mortified. I think that's the only way to describe the expression on his face. I do feel bad for him, of course I do, but not bad enough to regret buying this place. You're an expert. You've worked on old houses hundreds of times before. What do you think of the Grey Lady's energy? Does it disturb you? Are you picking up any bad vibes on the property? Because if you are, why am I not seeing it? All I'm seeing is what the house will one day become, when she's brought back to her former glory.
I shuffled awkwardly on my feet. Some people are drawn to houses, ma'am, like you were drawn to your husband on that ocean liner. It's not something you can actually explain tangibly. Maybe the Grey Lady is reaching out to you for help, and you've responded to her cries. Stranger things have happened, you know. But I'm not going to lie to you, Mrs. Peterson. The house does possess a menacing energy, as if something very bad happened here. Do you know anything about the history concerning this house? It's always good to look into the history of any house you buy, especially if it's old. Think about it. If you were marrying a man who had been through 5 wives, you'd be an absolute fool not to investigate what went wrong with all his previous marriages, would you not?
That does make an awful lot of sense, Mr. Benalodge. Now that you mention it, of course. I suppose it does explain why the Grey Lady never sold over the last 20 years. I can tell you the history connected to this place in detail if you like. In short, 2 people went missing in this particular house, and I suspect it put people off buying it. I mean, old Victorian houses like this are usually highly sought after and in great demand, but this house has not sold in so many years. It's desperately sad. But I really want to fix her up, and in my gut, I know it's the right decision for me. I meant to live here. Coming here for the first time with that estate agent was for me like coming home. All the stories connected to this property did not put me off buying it in the slightest. On the contrary, made me want to buy this place all the more. At the moment, Mr. Benalodge, me and my husband are currently renting a place in Denver. I think he's glad to leave the gutting of the Grey Lady to me. I'm sure he's privately dreading moving into this place. But I'm hoping by the time you guys have transformed it, he'll love it as much as I do. I just know it's going to look amazing when it's completed. I just hope that Roland will share my enthusiasm.
Mrs. Peterson, we can work miracles in our restoration projects, I can assure you. But energy is another story. You need to look into ways you can shift the energy.
but we can talk about that together later. Perhaps you can tell me a little about the history of this place. As you were saying, it might help me understand the house a little better." When Lizelle had completed telling me about the stories connected to the Grey Lady, I began to completely understand why the house seemed so desolate, so dreadfully defeated. It had picked up the brooding, deflated energy of the former residents of the home, namely 2 grieving men over the years who had lost their wives in very distressing situations, believing a beast that to me fits the description of a dogman abducted and lightly killed them. Some people, of course, believe cryptic creatures like Dogman and Bigfoot don't actually exist, but the idiosyncratic appears to have touched my life far too many times for me to doubt such things. Let's just say there are more things on heaven and earth than actually meets the eye. I suspect both men that lived in the Grey Lady had been filled with anger, frustration, and inconsolable grief, which are dense, low-frequency vibrations that easily invite disease and despair into our lives. The Grey Lady was like a prune marinating in her grief. It made sense to me that she was in such melancholia. I, of course, assured Lizelle Peterson that I would get my men working on the property at once. We would get the yard attended to, the paths in the woodgrove cleared. We would bring the Grey Lady back to what she'd been in the 1800s. I, of course, persuaded Lizelle Peterson, once this was completed, that we should get in a psychic medium or a priest to bless the house, to lift off the depression. Lizelle was excited about such an idea.
"I know when I bring Roland back to the house, he's not going to believe it's the same place."
"We will do our best, ma'am, to restore the Grey Lady for you," I assured her. But I had an instinctive hunch it was not going to be so easy. Sometimes in life you get people that try as you might to help them overcome the drug or alcohol addiction that afflicts them, or to let go of their grief. They hang on to it for dear life, refusing to let it go. I had a feeling that the hapless Grey Lady was not going to shift her heavy energy very easily, for she'd been languishing it in her woe-begotten melancholia for far too long. The house had almost become its grief. The moment my men saw the Grey Lady for the first time, they could immediately sense the sad, lamentable energy of the house, but they were not remotely intimidated by the project. Lesser men would lightly have refused to work at the Grey Lady, claiming the place gave them the creeps. But my men wanted to salvage the house, bring it out of its lugubrious melancholia, and were up for the challenge, and this was as good as any. "Something bad happened here," one of my workmen told me. I wisely chose not to tell my workmen the Eldridge stories connected to the property. I didn't think it would be wise in the circumstances to share such pernicious details. I had an instinctive hunch that the moment my men started to gut the Grey Lady, we would more than likely stir up some rather disquieting paranormal activity. And it seems I was not wrong about that. It was in the first few weeks of working on the interior of the house that my men began to hear the unsettling sounds of a woman weeping. It was, of course, very distressing for them. They couldn't find the source of the weeping, where the crying was coming from. But it was unsettling, to say the very least. Then they would hear footsteps running up and down the creaking staircase, and would often feel cold spots in the house. My men had, of course, experienced this all before. This was not something new to them, so they weren't easily scared off by such strange anomalies, as it went with the territory of working in old houses that are wrapped up in a rich, illustrious history. And when you gut a house, it's like peeling away a layer of an onion. You have no idea what you might happen to encounter. But I will say this, it certainly makes our jobs far more interesting. And let's just say when I attend a dinner party, When I'm out with my wife, I'm the one that always has a story to tell, that grabs the guests' attention, and over a campfire, on a camping trip, I never disappoint. If that was not curious enough for you, a couple of the landscapers that I hired to attend to the yard at the Grey Lady had an overwhelming, bodeful sense that something in the grove, very menacious, was watching them, and the discomposing, bodeful impression rattled them significantly. The wood grove of rather grandiose, tall, lofty trees fringed the left-hand side of the property, magnanimously sprawling out into open pastures and ponds. But throughout the extensive property there were large clusters of trees gathered together, like congregations of people at an outdoor church gathering. It, of course, frustrated my two landscapers that although they felt watched the whole time, they could see nothing there. It made them feel as if they were losing leave of their senses, getting spooked over absolutely nothing, for no reason at all. "I feel like I'm going mad," said a man called Fabian who works for me, "since me and Tuffman, who was his co-worker, have been working here in the yard. It would seem that this gnawing, discombobulating feeling that we're getting of being watched the whole time just will not abate. It gives me the creeps, let me tell you. And it's not just the house that's haunted, believe me. It's this whole damn place. It's insidiously evil. I feel it to the core of my bones." This is exactly what Fabian told me. "I'm sorry," he said, "but who in their right mind buys a place like this? The owner should have sold this house to Universal Studios for a horror movie. You wouldn't even need staging effects or special lighting. This place, it's got it all. It's so damn foreboding. Excuse the bad language, but that's how I feel about this place. In all the years I've been working in people's yards, I've never got the chills like I have here," he explained. I assured the both of them that the landscapers were probably feeling something very tangible. I wasn't going to pussyfoot around, was I? I wasn't going to tell them what they wanted to hear. That is not how I operate, nor do I wilfully brush their concerns under the carpet, in the hope that they would go away. Instead, I was completely truthful with both men, telling them their feelings were not the figment of a wild imagination, and yes, more than likely the Grey Lady was haunted. But I told them to try not to let the issue bother them. I knew my words probably fell on deaf ears. Both men were obviously deeply troubled, but I'm very thankful they did not abandon their jobs as they could have done. I guess they knew that that would be a futile exercise. I have two men working for me that have been with me from day one since I started this business of mine in restoring old homes. Michael Russell and Bart Rodriguez, both men who are exemplary at their jobs and very skilled workmen. They're not scared off or intimidated by working incredibly hard in restoring the interiors and exteriors of old historic homes. They're the kind of men that will do a job thoroughly, never ever taking any shortcuts to achieve their goals. One day both men went for a smoking break outside their truck, and boy, did they have a story to tell me that had the hairs on the back of my neck standing up on end, which made me realize that even though the Grey Lady has been neglected for many years, that something was still going on here.
Bart Rodriguez's story. Bart Rodriguez was feeling consumed by exhaustion. He didn't know what it was about the Grey Lady, but of all the historic houses he'd worked on over the years, the Grey Lady had unabashedly sucked out his energy like a succubus from the very, very beginning. If he had not known better, he'd likely feel he needed to go to his healthcare provider to have a full physical checkup.
as if his body was harbouring some kind of underlying illness that needed investigating. He knew the other men working on the Grey Lady felt as spent and as fatigued as he did, so his health was not the problem. The house was. It would seem all the workmen felt their seeping energy was immediately restored once they'd left the property. Bart had experienced this paradoxical exhaustion before, in a couple of old historic houses he'd worked for painstakingly in the past. Indeed, he'd worked in an old house before, where almost the entire family, over 11 children, had died of the smallpox in the 1800s. He remembered one day suddenly becoming incredibly cold as he was working in the house on a hot summer's day. He was surprised because it was such a hot day out there. There was no explanation to explain the extreme coldness he was suddenly feeling, almost as if he'd stepped into a refrigeration unit. Sensing that he was not alone, Bart had wilfully turned around, and then he'd seen a young boy sitting there woefully on the staircase, with dark, formidable circles under his eyes that looked so red, as if he'd been crying for many long hours. The boy was desperately sad. Bart was momentarily stunned and rather bemused. He wondered who this mysterious boy was, where he'd come from, because he looked as real as you or me. But he was not dressed typically like a boy from the 21st century. All of a sudden he could hear a woman's distressed sobs, echoing through the house, not dissimilar to the crying sounds he'd recently been hearing in the Grey Lady of late. The sound of a woman's inconsolable grief. The young boy looked up at Bart. "Mother is crying, because my sisters and brothers are all dead. Everybody is very sick. We are all going to die. It's only me and my mother left, but it won't be long. It's coming for us too." And with that, the boy just vanished. The experience had left Bart feeling incredibly sad. It was the same distressing feeling he experienced working here at the Grey Lady. What could have happened here, he wondered, but he told himself that some things were better not knowing, as he sensed the story connected to the Grey Lady was probably not one he would like to actually hear. "I'm exhausted," he told Michael, when he put down his hammer. "I'm going out for a smoke. Are you coming out with me or not? I could do with a smoking companion." "Of course I'm coming," said Michael, giving him a wicked grin. "When have I ever said no to a smoke? When I get home I can't even touch a cigarette. That wife of mine thinks I've actually given up. If she knew the truth, she'd have my guts for garters, and believe me, it wouldn't be pretty." "You're kidding, right?" asked Bart. "You mean to tell me your wife doesn't notice you smell like a chimney when you return home from work? I mean, you get through an entire pack a day. Has she got blinders on or something? Surely she can tell you haven't given up. She must smell you coming from a mile off. I can tell you smell of cigarette smoke by just standing next to you. You smoke far more than I do." "I have my reinforcements," said Bart rather bashfully, pulling out a packet of extra strong peppermints from the upper pocket of his plaid shirt that he was wearing. "They do the trick very nicely, thank you very much. If my clothes smell of cigarettes, I blame you, Michael, for smoking in my presence, and the wife appears to believe my story. I hide the cigarettes cunningly in my work tools after work, as I know my wife would never look in my toolbox for anything. That wife of mine couldn't even change a light bulb if you asked her to." Bart shrugged his shoulders. "Good luck with pulling that off, bro. I hate to tell you this, Mike, but you're deluding yourself if you think you can keep this deceptive charade up. In my humble experience, if you've got a secret from the wife, it'll be squeezed out like the last remaining toothpaste in a tube, because believe me, something untoward will likely happen to expose your wife to the truth. And personally, I wouldn't like to be in your shoes when your wife finds out your dirty little secret." "Don't say that, Bart. Don't tempt fate on my behalf. How can I possibly be expected to give up the habit? I've been smoking for 20 years, for God's sake. My wife thinks one morning I can just get up like that and say bye-bye to cigarettes. It doesn't work like that, let me tell you. Just because my wife managed to give up smoking so easily doesn't mean we're all made of the same stuff. It's true, you know, what they say about reformed smokers. They're the most critical of the habit of all. My wife gets onto her soapbox any time she sees her own brother smoking. She henpecks him tirelessly, you know. I'll be damned if I let her do that to me. I'm just saying, Michael, if I were you, I would tell her, said Bart. I'd come clean with her.
The two men began talking about everything and nothing, blowing out coils of smoke in the air, and occasionally glancing towards the woodgrove.
It's funny, said Bart. Do you know what? I feel as if something is watching us from the woods. It's making my skin crawl. It's especially bad right now.
Michael threw his cigarette butt onto the ground, grazing it with his boot, twisting the stub with the rotating movement of his ankle, so it was savagely crushed like a bug. He looked up towards the grove and then back rather solemnly at Bart.
You feel it too, he almost whispered. I've been feeling it every time I take a smoke out here, that we're not alone. I understand that both men working in the landscaping in the yard have been feeling a presence watching them while they work. I'm telling you, bro, there's something about this whole house and the land here that I find rather unsettling, not to put too fine a point on it. I've heard the sound of a woman crying like you have, and the footsteps up and down the staircase at all hours of the day. But I sense something very, very bad happened here. I mean, the grey lady herself is like a woman in mourning, is she not? Even after the trees around the house were cut down, I thought more light would shine on her walls, lighten up the place. But the house still looks dark and austere, don't you think? I think it does look dark, and I sense it too, admitted Bart soberly. You have to be very disconnected from reality not to pick up on the lugubrious energy out here. I mean, I've seen the woman. What's her name again? The woman who bought this place. Oh, you mean Lizelle Peterson? That's right, said Bart. Now, she bought this house, did she not? It was on the market, you know, for 20 years, Michael. Think about that for a moment. And then she purchased the place out of the blue like that. Fell in love with it, she did. And for the life of me, Michael, I cannot think why. I mean, I appreciate houses of history, of course I do. But this place makes my skin crawl. When I was speaking to her the other day, she told me she was drawn to the grey lady, but her husband doesn't like it at all. She believes he's dreading moving in. Poor man, said Michael. He has my deepest sympathy. I mean, it's one thing working here restoring the property, but living here, no, thank you very much. Can you imagine what it must be like in the middle of the night? Staying over here, sleeping in your bed, hearing the sounds of the house, because no matter what we do to fix this place up, old houses always make noises. I don't think I'd be able to get any sleep at night.
Michael paused for a brief moment, glancing at the woodgrove quizzically.
You know what? I've been thinking about what you've just said, Bart. We've both been experiencing the feeling of being watched, he said. So it can't be our imaginations, can it? You mark my words. There's got to be something in that grove that explains the feeling we both have. I don't know about you, but I'd like to find out what it is. I guess I've got an insatiable curiosity. I cannot help myself. You know, last year I went to the Christmas tree to check what my wife had got me for Christmas. I found the parcel and began to guess what it was, feeling it with my fingers like a kid. I mean, I'm 38. I'm an old man, for goodness sake. But I have an unquenchable need to know what she got me for Christmas. I sneaked into the bathroom to open the present carefully, making sure not to tamper with the paper, because my wife would know if I'd been fiddling around with a present. Let me tell you, that wife of mine has got the eyes of a hawk. I discovered she'd got me a lovely sweater, but it was the wrong size, of course, and the most hideous orange colour that you've ever seen. But the receipt was in the present, so I clandestinely took it back to the store without my wife knowing, changed the colour and the size, and when I opened it up on Christmas Day, you should have seen my wife's face, Bart. It was a picture. She looked completely bewildered. She said to me, "That's so strange. I could swear I brought you an orange sweater, not a blue one. I must be going completely senile." I mean, I'm sorry, Bart, but only people in a prison wear an orange colour like that, and I wouldn't be seen dead in a sweater like that. Anyway, she just shook her head, stared at my blue sweater, and said, "I must be so mad. I must be going out of my head. I don't know what's wrong with me." I told her that I was very pleased with my sweater, and was very glad that it wasn't orange. Bart laughed. "I cannot believe you did that, bro. You're one hell of a nosy busybody. You clearly have not grown up, have you?" "So are you up for it or not?" asked Michael. "Up for what?" asked Bart, blowing out another wisp of smoke. "Going into the wood grove, of course, to see who or what has been watching us. I'm telling you, something is there. It's not our imagination. Maybe it's a vagrant who's made his home in the woods, set up a campsite perhaps, and is watching us clandestinely. It wouldn't be the first time such a thing has happened." "You want to check it out?" asked Bart. "Of course I want to check it out. I wouldn't be asking you to come with me otherwise." "All right, I will come with you, but I'm not happy about it at all. I'm quite sure we will not see anything. And if something has been insidiously watching us in plain sight, and we can't see it, I don't think going into the grove will make any difference, unless, of course, we do stumble across a camping site from a vagrant, which in my opinion is very unlikely." "Humour me, then," said Michael insistently. "I just want to check it out, bro, that's all, for my own peace of mind. I like explanations for things, you see. Hands on heart, I just don't want to go in there alone. The woods look menacing to me. Somehow the house and the wood grove, they reflect each other in a negative way, if you know what I mean. And those trees are sizable monsters, are they not? They may actually be as old as the house itself, or maybe even older. Who knows?" "Maybe it's the trees watching us," said Bart. "I mean, they almost looked humanoid with their outstretched boughs, don't you think? But fair enough. We'll go in there for a while to check it out. But I promise you this, Michael, you're going to be disappointed. Nothing will be there. And I don't think a vagrant has been watching us. I just don't. Sometimes things just can't be explained. And the one thing we know about this house is that it's paradoxical. It's enigmatic. It's very cryptic, you could say. Nothing about this place makes any sense to me at all." "Are you kidding, bro? Of course I won't be disappointed. I will be heartily relieved to go into the woods and just investigate for a while. And if there's nothing, so be it. When I was a kid, I loved playing in the woods all the time. But those woods were benevolent and friendly. This grove of trees is anything but. I don't know how to explain it, but something's off, and I want to get to the bottom of this enigmatic mystery. My father always used to say to me growing up that there's usually an explanation for everything. Well, come, let's go, shall we? Before I change my mind in a hurry," said Bart. which I'll be inclined to do if you keep harping on and on about how creepy the woods are. You're only reinforcing my obvious reluctance to come with you."
Bart was not sure why he'd agreed to follow Michael into the woodgrove. They had a lot of work to do back at the Grey Lady, and were running behind in some of their projects that Lizelle Peterson wanted completed as soon as possible. When Bart agreed to do something, it would be cowardice of him to backpedal now. So they approached the woodgrove of trees with a measure of reluctance, while the feeling of being watched became even more pronounced, and whatever was watching them was clearly menacingly evil. Bart could feel chills running down his spine, and a little voice in his head whispered to him to get out of the grove. But he injudiciously followed his friend through the trees. The voice turned up its static scream in his head. "Don't go in there! Don't go in there! Leave now!"
"Are you sure this is a good idea, bro?"
said Bart, unable to disguise the uneasy tremble in his voice.
"There's work back at the house to be done. How about we do this another time?"
He was hoping and praying that Michael would agree with him, but Michael did not.
"We won't be long, Bart. I told you we're just going to take a sneaky look. See if we can see anything untowards in the woods. We won't be long, I can promise you that." "What exactly are you looking for?" asked Bart gingerly. "A tent or a hammock, perhaps?" "I don't exactly know," Michael admitted. "But let's just say I will know it when I either see it or find it."
The two men ambled very cautiously through the trees, Bart with a wary reticence, and Michael with an unbridled curiosity that was not easily tamed. There was no doubt, Bart privately decided, that Michael was a natural inborn investigator. It was almost certain he'd stop at nothing to find out the source of what had been staring at them from the woodgrove, if indeed anything had been. Some of the paths in the woodgrove had been industriously cleared away, but it still remained insidiously dark. It was a hostile environment, where they were buttressed in by well-established mature trees on every side, and thorny briars did not seem remotely adverse to snapping at their clothes and tearing at their skin. Not even a sneaky bit of daylight seemed to choose to trickle through the open branches of the trees, almost as if the light itself wanted no part of this hauntingly airy place, and just shrank away from it. Bart felt like they were walking through a subterranean oasis. The trees themselves, on closer inspection, were ancient but spectacular, both in girth and size, and their interesting shapes made you think of great works of sculpture that you might see in a museum of art. There was a mixed collection of trees in the grove that were as individualistic and unique as the strangers in a crowd. But there was nothing remotely friendly about this place, nothing at all. Bart would describe it as a little like being in Jurassic Park, wondering what kind of Machiavellian, disingenuous monster would come trampeding through the undergrowth in any given moment. He kept nervously looking over his shoulders, half expecting to see a Tyrannosaurus Rex come barreling through the trees, charging directly towards him. All of a sudden, the woodgrove miraculously slipped into a rather benign, rather friendly energy, like a man who's changed his socks, disposing of the former manky, smelly ones he was wearing for a fresh new pair. It was almost like they were walking in a pleasant oasis, where the trees were filled with the chirping sounds of the birds. They encountered squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, and the occasional deer darting away. Bart persuaded himself that if anything predatory were lurking in the woods, these animals would almost certainly not be around. So he began to physically relax, following his friend more casually, as they sauntered down the earthen paths, littered with fallen leaves, their ankles brushing against shrubs and verdant ferns. Bart was filled with a growing sense of confidence. Of course, this was like any other woodgrove. For a moment he almost forgot the tangle of nervousness that had held him hostage only moments before, when he felt pleasingly enveloped in a serene energy. He wondered what he'd got so fired up about. There was nothing menacious about this place after all. He'd built it all up in his head.
but these growing feelings of security would soon pass. It was when they came to a particular unholy, desecrated part of the grove they encountered no bird song whatsoever, no living signs of life at all. It was so disturbingly quiet, so much so that the impending silence itself stung the two men with a clawing claustrophobia and a profound sense of dread. Both men stopped short in their tracks when they saw an ugly gnarled tree obstructing their path. The ill-omened tree was decorated with animal bones and skulls that were hung on the tree by threads of leather, dangling on the branches like a collection of Christmas decorations. It was almost like an ominous get-out sign. "What the hell?" said Michael, staring at the tree in abject astonishment. "This is seriously gross," he said. "I mean, something or someone put these bones on the tree, did they not? It's like whoever they are, they're telling us to get the hell out of here. It's like a skull and crossbones danger sign, don't you think?" "It's freaking me the hell out," agreed Bart. "Let's get out of here now. I feel as if something formidable is watching us. I'm telling you, Michael, someone is here. We need to get out of here. It smells disgusting around here too, as if something is rotting. Can you smell it?" "It smells revolting," Michael agreed. All of a sudden they heard a little bleating sound, like that of an animal. "What's that?" asked Michael. "I don't care what it is," said Bart, his eyes growing wide with terror. "Let's get out of here now. Something is watching us, and whatever it is, it's not good." Michael ignored Bart. "Hold on a moment, Bart. I think an animal's in trouble. Let's check it out for a moment, and then we'll go." Bart reluctantly followed his friend behind the trees, towards the strange crying sound. Michael let out an astonished cry. "Bart, you're not going to believe it. It's over here, bro. Come and look at this." "What is it?" asked Bart, crawling rather uncomfortably behind his friend, with a sense of foreboding gnawing at his guts. Bart's mouth dropped open when he observed a large, sizable nest on the ground, made from twigs and branches, interspersed between foliage, where animal bones had become bleached by time, but one skull staring back at them was unquestionably human, and Bart was too astonished and paralyzed with fear to even react. That was when Bart's eyes saw the baby deer, lying in the nest, as if it had been brought here by a predator to eat as a snack when the time was right. The deer was so delicate, its body trembling and shaking. It was crying and bleating for its mother. Bart very tenderly picked up the little fawn in his arms, lifting up its speckled torso to his chest, stroking the frightened little thing with its dark eyes that were filled with terror. But Bart's soothing words appeared to calm and comfort the creature, almost as if it knew it was being rescued. "It's going to be all right," he kept telling the little fawn. "You're safe now. You're with us." "Poor thing," said Michael. "Let's get the hell out of here now. There's a human skull in that nest, Bart. Whatever is in the woods is obviously predatory. We don't want to be its next meal," he said, now physically shaking. Both men, not given to being scared by very much, well, at least Michael wasn't, began rocketing out of the woods, with hearts thundering and booming, breath squeezed out of all their oxygen. They were certain something was following them, but then when they looked over their shoulders, nothing was there. Bart was clutching the fawn very closely to his chest when the men finally exited the trees. He then turned briefly around to look back over his shoulders, and that was when he held his breath, as though paralyzed by confoundment. He was staring at a long, lanky creature, standing about 7 foot tall, like a man, covered in mangy, dark brown hair, with the head of a wolf. Bart was certain he was seeing a dog-man. Indeed, he was in no doubt about what he was actually seeing. He had heard of such cryptic creatures before, but he never entertained the probability that such things could actually exist in our reality and in North America. The dog-man appeared to be swaggering backwards and forwards on his legs, like an inebriated drunk, with what Bart would later describe as a cocky arrogance, as if the beast was delighting in Bart's obvious terror, and almost getting off on it. But the dark eyes that glinted with a red reflective light were indeed the most evil, malevolent eyes that Bart had ever beheld. He hurriedly closed his eyes as quickly as he could, to will the dreadful beast away, and when he slowly opened them again, the dogman was gone. "Please, please, may this be my imagination." But Bart knew he was holding on to a limp, bedraggled, furiously fragile hope that was wasted in its good intentions. For however fleeting it may have been, Bart had almost certainly seen a dogman, and he knew at once that this treacherously artful creature had been purged from the bowels of hell itself, like something the devil had spat out of his mouth after dinner. Whatever it was, he knew that this creature was the very reason the workers of the Grey Lady felt watched the whole time. "Did you see it, Michael?" he asked his friend. "Did you see it in the trees?" "See what?" asked Michael. "Nothing," said Bart, shaking his head, deciding privately that he'd keep what he had seen to himself. He was wondering what he should do about the little fawn in his arms. Then, to his amazement, his searching eyes were drawn to a little figure peering at them from one corner of the grove, from behind a tree. He had seen the female doe, who appeared to be watching them. He knew unequivocally it was the fawn's mother. How he knew this, he wasn't sure. He ran very discreetly towards the doe, to about 50 feet away from the mother, placing the fawn very gently on the ground, and backing away from the scene, to invite the mother doe to approach her youngling. What a stroke of luck, he thought, that she had auspiciously, almost by magic, appeared on the scene at this pivotal moment in time. Bart would have had to take the little fawn to an animal sanctuary otherwise. Michael and Bart watched in wondrous awe as the mother doe moved very gently towards her fawn. Seeing them reunited together again was so precious, and seconds later the little fawn was making up for lost time, nuzzling its mother. The female doe watched Bart and Michael through her dark eyes, but she did not run away. "It's as if she's saying thank you," said Bart. "Have you ever?" said Michael, sounding astonished. This was a day that had dealt out ingredients that were not for the faint-hearted by any manner of means, and it would seem both men were trying to digest the gravity of what they had encountered in the woods. But it was Bart who had seen the dogman, and you cannot unsee a dark scribble on your reality like that is cutthroat in its magnitude of horror, that burns into your mind. Bart knew that he'd never forget the insidious beast, for he'd never beheld anything so awful in his entire life. "Bart," said Chris tentatively, "just pretend you didn't see what you saw in the grove. Please don't tell anyone about the nest, and about the tree we saw, with the bones dangling over the branches. But, Michael, you forget we saw a human skull in that nest. We can't possibly ignore that. It could be someone's loved one we're talking about. Something's living in that nest, Bart, and it must have killed that person. I think the least we need to do is go to Paul Benelodge. Tell him what happened."
Paul Benelodge's account.
"I knew when both Bart and Michael came to see me, wearing on their forlorn faces expressions incredibly solemn, that I knew something profound had happened to the both of them. My heart did a belly flop. What was it they wanted to convey to me, I wondered. I was not sure that I actually wanted to hear what they had to say. Both of the men began to tell me almost at once how they decided to investigate the woodgrove. They wanted to find out why they could not shake off the hauntingly airy feeling that they were being watched all the time, which was an experience all had encountered working at the Grey Lady.
I must confess, Mr. Benelodge, it was bothering me significantly. Michael confessed to me. I mean, every time I've been out of my truck, having a smoke, something's been watching us. I could feel it to the core of my bones, and so could Bart. So I persuaded him to just go and look in the grove, to see if our fears of being watched were unfounded. I mean, the trees themselves look like sinister humanoid monsters, do they not? We were wondering if perhaps they were the cause of this discombobulating feeling we were experiencing. Or was some vagrant camping out in the grove and spying on us, which we both gleamed was also a possibility. We went into the grove, and although it was dark and dingy, it was relatively benign in there. Until, of course, we encountered what I can only describe as a gnarled-looking tree, decorated with bones that had been inauspiciously tied onto the branches like Christmas decorations. And let's just say, the macabre sight was more than a little discomposing. It rarely spooked the both of us. I hasten to say the tree was located in an area of the grove that was unnervingly quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. So it set our nerves on edge. You couldn't hear any bird song in there, and that part of the grove was as lifeless as a parched desert. It was awful, Mr. Benelodge, Bart agreed. You got a sense you were being told to stay the hell away. I promise you, the moment I saw the tree with the bones hanging on it, I got the message loud and clear. Worse still, the grove stank of decomposing flesh that burnt the back of my eyes and my throat. It was very unpleasant. It made me want to gag and be violently sick. We both heard a bleating sound, and I discovered little Bambi lying in this ugly nest, made out of twigs and grass, filled with bones. Huge it was. One of those bones was a human skull. "What?" I said, my slouched, relaxed posture becoming as straight as a pencil. "Are you sure it was a human skull?" I asked. "Could you not have been mistaken?" This, I knew, was not good news. It might mean I had to call the police, and that was the last thing we needed on this property. Crime scene tape everywhere. Police crawling around the place like a long line of carpenter ants. Beyond all that, it could postpone the refurbishing of the property, and that would be a very significant setback. "We're sure," said Michael soberly. "It was definitely a human skull, I'm afraid." "There is more to the story," said Bart pensively, looking from both me to Michael with an awkward uncomfortableness, as if he was rather reluctant to share something with us. "I didn't tell you this, Michael. I'm not sure why, but I guess I'm just trying to process this all in my head. But I think I know who the nest belongs to, and who hung all those bones over the tree branches, and who also was responsible for putting little Bambi in his nest to eat later as a snack." "Who?" asked Michael, looking confounded. "Did you see something, Bart, when we were in the wood grove? I knew you were acting funny when we reunited Bambi with his mother. I knew you were hiding something. What the hell did you see? Spill it, for goodness sake." "I did see something," Bart admitted. "I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I thought you'd seen it too, when we were walking through the trees. I was carrying Bambi in my arms, holding him close to my chest. You were leading the way through the trees, Michael. I was walking behind you. I turned around to look over my shoulders for a brief second, and that was when I saw him. He was a huge dog man, standing there between the trees, watching me. I swear this thing was laughing at us, cocking its head from side to side, wobbling unsteadily on its feet, as though intoxicated. This thing was getting off on our fear, Michael. I know it was. It was the most gruesome creature I have ever beheld. The hair on the back of my arms was standing up on end. You're lucky, bro, you didn't see it. But are you sure you saw a dogman? Could you not have been mistaken? Asked Michael. I'm absolutely sure, said Bart. This thing was hell of a scary. It was laughing at me. I don't know what to say, said Michael. I guess it explains a whole lot. You're going to have to take me to the nest before we call the police, I told both of my men. I need to see the nest for myself and observe the human skull that you're talking about. But we don't want to go in there again, Mr. Benelodge, said Bart. What if the dog man comes after us? This thing is predatory, dangerous. There was a skull in the nest, a human skull, I promise you. Take my word for it. Just call the police and be done with it. I'm afraid, Bart, I cannot do that until I'm fully satisfied that there is indeed a human skull in the nest you saw. Rest assured, we will go in the grove together fully armed for our protection. But you do need to show me where the nest is. I decided not to tell both men about two women from the past who resided at the Grey Lady, who had supposedly gone missing over the years, believed to have been abducted and killed by a dogman. Some things were best not shared, especially now when both Bart and Michael were in a fragile state of mind. I did not need them falling apart on me or abandoning our work at the Grey Lady. Both Michael and Bart did not need their feathers more shaken than they already were. Ostensibly, both these men were not the kind of people given to being rattled so easily. I knew that Bart had seen something. Regretfully, both men were exceedingly reluctant to go into the grove, but I had to find the nest they'd seen, and I persuaded them to oblige my request, and thank God I did, for I would have looked foolish if I had called the police. Bart was acting very fearful, looking around all the time like a frightened kid, so I felt rather bad dragging him into the woods again, but it just could not be helped. That's the tree over there, Mr. Benelodge, said Michael, pointing it out to me. But as we got closer to the crooked-looking tree, both men appeared rather bewildered and nonplussed. Bart was pointing at the tree with widened eyes. But I don't understand, Mr. Benelodge. The tree was covered with bones, I promise you it was. But they've been removed. There were tons of bones on this tree. Now they've gone. But are you sure you've pointed out the correct tree to me? I asked them. They both nodded. But what about the nest? Whereabouts is that? It's over here, said Michael, beckoning for me to follow him. I crawled behind some thorny briars at the back of the gnarled tree, and that was when Michael pointed to a barren patch of ground under the tree, bespeckled with a few stray leaves, but nothing was there. His face grew astonishingly white. What's wrong? I asked. Where is the nest? That's it. It's gone. It's vanished. The space has been cleared up. A moment ago it was there, I promise you. We're not making this up, Mr. Benelodge. I think the dogman that Bart saw got rid of all the evidence. We cannot call the police now. There's nothing to see. We'll look like complete imbeciles. Oh, officer, there's a skull in a nest, but it's gone. They'll probably think we're smoking weed. You're right, I told them. We can't possibly call the police without incriminating evidence. They'll think we're 3 sheets to the wind. But for the record, I believe your story. I do think the nest belonged to a dogman. And by the sounds of things, he's an emotionally intelligent and very clever creature. Shrewd enough to cover up his tracks after you discovered his nest. That's clever for sure. So you believe us? Asked Bart, looking surprised. I mean, this is a beast that most would call mythical. And you believe our account? If the boot were on the other foot, Mr. Benelodge, I'm not sure I would believe you. Of course I believe you. And I will tell you one day why I do. I told the men, but now is not the time to share such things with you. You can take the rest of the day off work. You have both had quite a shock, I need you back at work in the morning, bright and early. Understood?" Both men nodded appreciatively, sauntering off to their trucks, glad to finally get off the property. I could tell they'd been significantly rattled. This was a morning they would unlikely ever forget, but I realized it was exceedingly helpful that they'd encountered a dogman. It would seem an unorthodox creature from the past was still loitering around the wood grove. Could its negative energy be impacting the Grey Lady? While I collected my thoughts together, I decided what needed to be done. The first thing I would do was to call Lizelle Peterson, inform her on what my men had uncovered, and what I believed we should do about the problem.
Lizelle's account. I was excited about the transformations that were taking place on the Grey Lady, that I'd purchased for me and my husband. The house would ultimately one day become our family home, where we would raise our children. I knew in no uncertain terms that the mansion which I chose to call the Grey Lady would metamorphosize into a goddess once she was brought back to her former glory. The tragedy was that my husband failed to see the potential of the Grey Lady. She was more than just a house to me. From the moment I laid eyes on the house, I felt a need to rescue her from her lugubrious melancholia. I believed restoring her to her former glory would do just that. I thought my husband Roland would see the Grey Lady through my discerning eyes, but his reaction to the house hit a raw nerve for me. I was bitterly disappointed to see that he obviously hated the place with a burning passion, as if he couldn't even bear to look at it.
"Lizelle, sweetheart, I told you you could choose where you'd like us to live," he said to me coyly. "But I'm sorry this house you have chosen. I don't know what to say. I was not expecting this. It's a little like having an 18-year-old daughter, asking me to meet her fiancé for the very first time, and then I discover she's fallen madly in love with a very decrepit, cantankerous old man. I wouldn't be pleased with her choice, just like I'm not very pleased with your choice right now, Lizelle. This house. Oh, I don't know what to say."
How can you describe the Grey Lady like this? In my opinion, she's like a woman in mourning. I agree her energy is rather heavy at the moment, but don't you see it's because she's been neglected for so long? Once we give her a facelift, you'll barely recognise her.
"Well, I hope you're right, sweetheart," said Roland, sweeping me lovingly into his arms. "I do hope you're right. I'm not sure that you are. I wonder, once the house has been gutted and refurbished, will the energy actually shift? That's what I'd like to know."
"But of course it will. Don't be so negative," I said. "Think about it, Roland. If you were a street urchin lying on the street, scrambling around for scraps, wearing shabby clothes and covered in dirt, you're going to look pretty miserable, aren't you? But when you're nicely cleaned up with a new set of clothes and a bath, you're going to be a happy camper, aren't you? It's the same for the Grey Lady."
"But is it? Supposing the street urchin you're talking about is still miserable, in his own skin, or her skin if you like, after her makeover. It could be the same for this house, even when you bring it back into shape. Who's to say that the dark energy will actually shift?"
"But of course it will," I said, but my words began to lack confidence, because my husband's clawing, sticky words had hit a raw nerve. What if he was right? And after the renovations of the Grey Lady, she continued to look so oppressively gloomy. Then all my dreams for the place would go up in a pillar of smoke. Imagine my surprise when a couple of months after Mr. Benelodge's team was working hard on renovating the Grey Lady, I got a phone call from him. He was managing the restoration project of my home. He insisted on seeing me at once, as he had something urgently important to convey to me. So I dropped everything I was doing and hurried over to the Grey Lady. And when I saw Paul Benelodge, I knew what he had to say was profound, and it definitely concerned the property that I'd purchased.
"We have a problem, Mrs. Peterson," he told me.
"A problem? What kind of problem?" I asked him.
Brace yourself, Mrs. Peterson. This is not going to be easy to hear."
"You're scaring me, Mr. Benelodge. Please tell me, what's going on? You're freaking me out."
"Fair enough. I will cut to the chase, Mrs. Peterson. There is no easy way to tell you this, but 2 of my men working on the restoration project of your home have seen a dogman in the woods on your property. They found a nest with a human skull in it."
"What?" I gasped, throwing my hands over my mouth and staring at Mr. Benelodge with wide, startled eyes. "You're joking?" I asked.
"I wish I was joking, Mrs. Peterson, but I'm afraid I'm not. Of course, when I went investigating into the woodgrove myself to find the nest, it had mysteriously just vanished, as had the human skull, which in a way is a very good thing, as the police cannot be involved any more. But that skull could have been someone's loved one. But it will never be found now, because the nest is no longer there. But let me tell you, it must have belonged to the dogman that one of my men saw."
"So your man saw a dogman? The same as the 2 families that lived at the Grey Lady. They also witnessed dogmen from the past, remember?"
"I'm afraid so, Mrs. Peterson. You know the dogman stories are related to the history of the Grey Lady, where 2 women were clearly snatched by a dogman, fitting the description of the creature that my man saw. I imagine the story has been controversial over the years. Many people in North America believe that this creature is a mythical beast. Not so, Mrs. Peterson. These things appear to rarely exist. I assure you both my men are reliable witnesses. As I was saying, it was Bart who saw the dogman in detail. He knows what he saw, and he is one of the most level-headed people I know. So I completely trust his account. He'd never make a fictitious story up like this. Furthermore, Bart has not been influenced by the history of this property, for he knows nothing of it. I do not know what this dogman is doing on the premises, Mrs. Peterson, but I do know this. We need answers. I propose we get a psychic medium to visit the Grey Lady, to give us her take on what is going on here. I personally do not understand any of this, but I will say one thing unequivocally, Mrs. Peterson, so I'm not going to mince my words. I believe this dogman imposes a very real threat to you and your husband. Such a beast destroyed 2 families living on this property. I would not want it to destroy both you and your husband, Roland. I could not live with myself if history repeated itself again, which is bound to happen if we don't get answers to this problem and reach a solution to deal with this dogman in some way."
"But I don't know what to say, Mr. Benelodge. It never occurred to me that such a beast would still be around after all these years. People have lived and died on this property, and he's still around. It makes no sense. I'm completely confounded. How does that even happen? I feel as if the breath has been sucked out of my lungs, almost as if I'd been flung into an alternative reality. I mean, all this stuff about cryptic creatures, it's so outlandishly bizarre. But I believe you, Mr. Benelodge. I really do believe that everything you've said is absolutely correct. And you're right, we need help. And a psychic medium would be a good start, as such a person might proficiently see through the muddy layers of our confusion, the things that we obviously can't see, the things beyond our grasp and comprehension."
"My thoughts exactly. And I know exactly who to contact, Mrs. Peterson, you'll be glad to know. I've been working with old historic homes for quite some time. This is not the first time I have called on the services of a psychic medium. I will be contacting a woman called Yvonne McBride. She really knows her stuff. In a nutshell, I think she will be able to explain exactly what's going on here. Her spirit guides will give her the answers we are seeking. Of that I am most sure."
I was amazed when the psychic medium Yvonne McBride arrived at the premises with a Native American shaman at her side.
Both me and Mr. Benelodge had not anticipated she would bring a shaman with her. Yvonne MacBride was a small woman in stature. She was about 4 foot 2 inches tall, with a crop of grey short hair and brown lively eyes that danced with merriment, but at the very same time she seemed very serious in regards to the matter at hand. She was wearing a cashmere sweater in a pale, barely pink colour, with a grey pair of trousers that flared at the bottom and brushed against her slim ankles. The Native American shaman was surprisingly dressed like your average American man, wearing a mustard-coloured pair of chinos and a loose white cotton tunic. But when I saw him, I could almost imagine him, out on the open American plains, galloping on the back of a powerful jet-black stallion, wearing a magnificent full headdress of eagle's feathers. I noticed the shaman was wearing an interesting stone pendant around a very sturdy large neck. He had very noble-looking features, including prominent high cheekbones, and a powerful-looking chin. His weathered, well-lined skin was as warm as a chestnut, and he looked as if he didn't belong in civilian American clothes. One look at his brown hooded eyes, I knew this man was deeply spiritual. I instinctively perceived he could see things that others clearly could not. Our visitors at first did not greet me or poor Benelodge. They got out of their truck rather gingerly, as if focusing on their immediate environment, studying everything with a keen intrigue. I stood in the doorway of the Grey Lady with poor Benelodge at my side. We stood there watching our visitors with a curious interest. In truth, it felt like both Yvonne MacBride and the shaman had not even noticed we were actually there. It was like they were looking beyond the Grey Lady, seeing things that Paul and I were not privy to actually seeing. I was almost dreading what they would ultimately tell me. For a long time the shaman and the psychic stared at the Grey Lady, and then at the grove of trees. They looked at the trees for a very long time. They then locked eyes with each other, in some kind of telepathic exchange, and nodded. They proceeded to walk towards our front door, and that was when they both nodded at both me and Paul Benelodge in a friendly greeting. "You must be Mrs. Peterson," said Yvonne MacLeod, reaching out to take my hand in hers. "That's right," I said, shaking her hand and offering her a somewhat watery smile. "This is Mr. Benelodge. He's in charge of the restoration project here at the Grey Lady. He was the one that suggested I called you. I'm very glad you've come along. The workers on the property have experienced strange things around here, I'm afraid. We're wondering what your take on all of it is, which is why we called you out here. People working on the premises feel they're being watched all the time by something rather malevolent in the grove, and in the house itself there's been cold spots and the sound of a woman weeping." "That does not surprise me in the slightest, Mrs. Peterson. Let's just say there's been a lot of grief spent at this house. It's quite palpable, you know. You do realize, Mrs. Peterson, that the house itself reached out to you in person to save it." "Really? But why would it do that?" "Well, something about you resonated with it, I suspect. The original owner of this house, long since deceased, reached out to you from beyond the grave, believed you could negate the bad energy here. Your buying the property, Mrs. Peterson, was no accident. Contrary to popular belief, even accidents are sometimes pre-planned, you know, before we actually make our incarnation on this earth. Oh, do mind my manners. I get so carried away sometimes. I've not been to a property like yours for many years. The sorrowful energy here cuts you to the quick like a knife. Everything is tragically affected by the energy here, which can drag you right down and bring on dreadful feelings of fatigue. My name is Yvonne MacBride, and this is Hawkeye. He's a Native American shaman," she told us. "I brought him here because my guides informed me he would be very much needed in this venture. Hawkeye understands energy vortexes and meridians and portals and stuff like that on the land. My guides always give me judicious, seasoned advice, you see, before I agree to take on a project. I would never have come here if I hadn't felt obliged to do so. You do need help, or you could potentially be in very grave danger, Mrs. Peterson, I hate to tell you.
You do realize there's an interdimensional portal in your woods that has to be closed. Things are coming out of that portal, very bad things. One of them has been feeding on the fear he engenders among his victims. You see, Mrs. Peterson, some negative entities get their food from our fear, from our grief, helplessness, and despair. I had not told Yvonne MacLeod anything about what was going on the property, so I was completely nonplussed by what she was telling me. It was starting to make a whole lot of sense. "We need to go around the premises," she told me, "and then we will tell you about what we've gleaned from everything." Hawkeye simply nodded at us and said nothing at all. Yvonne McBride and Hawkeye walked around the property together. I couldn't keep my eyes off the both of them. I stood in the upstairs main bedroom, watching them through the glass pane of one of the windows, and that was when I saw a flash of something moving through the woods. It was so fleeting, but I knew at once I'd seen the dogman. I sensed it was upset that I had brought these people here to the Grey Lady, courtesy of Paul Benelodge. I felt certain that good was going to come from this experience, and we would ultimately be rid of the loathsome creature for good. For me, seeing the beast happen so very fast, that my first thought was, did I actually see that? And I began to doubt that I had. Before long, I was in the kitchen, bustling around with a kettle, while Hawkeye was beginning to draw pictures on a paper pad he'd brought along with him. He laid down the pictures on the table, for both me and Mr. Benelodge to inspect. 2 were pictures of women. One woman was clearly wearing 1800s clothes. I was sure it was a picture of Eleanor Bennet, who had been carried away by a dogman in the 1800s, if the stories were to be believed, that is. The other picture was of Molly Sinclair, from the 1950s. Of that I was in no doubt, as I had seen a picture of her before. Molly Sinclair was also believed to have been abducted by a dogman-like creature. Imagine my shock when the shaman presented me a picture of the dogman. My blood grew as cold as ice, as that was the creature I was sure I'd seen from the upstairs window, only moments before, with the body almost of a human, covered in hair, and the head of a wolf. I physically began to shake, while my blood grew as cold as ice. Yvonne MacLeod reached out to squeeze my hand. "Are you all right, dear? You've gone terribly white." "It's just a lot to take in, that's all. These pictures that Hawkeye has drawn make everything seem so dreadfully real." "I can imagine, my dear. None of this is easy for you to digest, I'm most sure. We're telling you stuff that sounds so wacko, something so far-fetched, that you'd get out of a novel or something. It's not something people can easily believe is real, but these things are happening in our world and in our reality. You would be surprised what goes on out there. Of course, people keep a lid on it for fear of being ridiculed or made fun of. And I imagine you will likely do very much the same once we've sorted this mess out for you. You'll probably never speak of the matter again, and I, for one, could never blame you for that. In the future, this will seem like a bad dream, and you'll likely ask yourself, did this actually happen? We've been around your property, Mrs. Peterson. We found out exactly what is going on here, in this house of yours. It makes perfect sense to the both of us. I have encountered residual sadness left by the people living here in the Grey Lady, most especially the 2 grieving husbands who resided here, both who tragically lost their beloved wives to this dogman-like beast that Hawkeye has drawn for you. This creature is very physical, you know. It slips in and out of our dimension, as easily as taking a lift from the ground floor to the 5th, so to speak. Well, that's what it would be like for this insidious beast. This house, Mrs. Peterson, I'm trying to work out how to explain this to you more clearly, and its former melancholic residents have literally been feeding this dogman, unintentionally, of course, because this creature is interdimensional, as I was saying. He comes out of a portal in your woods, I believe, and he's been feeding off fear and grief for thousands of years. Once this house was built in the 1800s, it became a vital food source for him, as the energy of people's fear in this house was like a storehouse of pilchards for the beast. Believe me, he was always ravenously hungry. The kind of hunger that can never be satisfied no matter how much he eats. Of course he eats human and animal flesh, but most of his energy is sustained from something we call louche, which is brought on by the adrenal charge or rush created by heightened terror and despair. You cannot physically see this louche kind of energy, any more than you can see the signal from your own television set. But believe me, it is there. I don't know how to put this delicately, Mrs. Peterson, because it's very difficult to do so. But let's just say if the louche was running out for the creature, he was about to have an increase in his supplies exponentially when you and your husband moved into the Grey Lady. You would be like a ship armed with new supplies docking at the port for the creature. You would likely have become his next abduction, Mrs. Peterson, and he'd have fed off your husband's despair, ensuring your husband did not leave the property, because he'd be so desperately trying to search for the creature in order to kill it. And in that way, the dogman would be feeding off your husband's despair. Mrs. Eleanor Bennet, who was the first legitimate owner of this property, Mrs. Peterson, tells me she was your great-great-grandmother, down the line or so. She was the one who guided you here to help close that portal in the woods. I think if you check your family genealogy, you will find this to be very accurate, which is why you were drawn to purchasing the property. Any crying you've heard in the property literally comes from Eleanor Bennet. She's revealed this to me. It's residual energy. She used to cry a lot because she was afraid of that dreadful beast in the woodgrove grabbing her. She knew he would eventually abduct her at some point in time. You're right about the creature, said Paul Benelodge. Both of my workmen discovered his nest in the woods. One of my workmen physically saw the beast, and what he describes fits the picture of what Hawkeye here has drawn.
So how do we proceed from here? I asked Yvonne MacLeod. How do we get rid of this dogman? Can we actually get rid of him? I mean, what about this portal you're speaking about? How do we stop the dogman from slipping into our dimension again? And how do we get him back into the portal? Very good, Mrs. Peterson. That is exactly what needs to happen. We need to send the dogman back to where he comes from. We're going to have to ask the both of you to leave this property in our charge for a couple of days, while me and Hawkeye close the portal for you with our cleansing ceremonies. We will bless the place, and Hawkeye will call on a guardian of the forest to protect the portal, so that it is permanently closed, and that the beast is sent back to its dimension, where it needs to stay. Believe me, Mrs. Peterson, when you return to the Grey Lady, after the house is cleansed and the portal closed, you will barely recognize this place. I can assure you of that. I thanked Yvonne MacLeod and Hawkeye, the Native American shaman, who hadn't said a word to me since we'd met, apart from drawing his pictures. I assumed that, like most spiritual men, he was probably very quiet. I was wondering whether the cleansing ceremony would actually work. But Yvonne MacLeod and Hawkeye seemed to know exactly what they were doing. I decided to put my trust in them, and when they informed me the ceremony was complete, I returned to the Grey Lady, wondering what I would find. Would the house feel any different for me? I drove down the drive and got out of my car. I gawked as I stared at the Grey Lady, in abject bewilderment, as if viewing her for the very first time in my life. I didn't even notice the psychic or Hawkeye walking towards me, as I was so caught up in the moment, so astonished by what I was beholding. Was this really the same house I had bought a while back? It couldn't be. There was no way. But it was the Grey Lady, who had risen from her melancholic slumber like a phoenix from the ashes. The Grey Lady had never looked more beautiful, more beguiling, more prepossessing. The heavy, dark, brooding energy that had clung around the house for so long, tarnishing her like a blackened piece of silver that had not been polished in years. It was as if the house had stepped out of a dark abyss, been wiped clean from its black, foggy mildew, and buffed up with a cleaning cloth. Now the light had magnanimously been invited in, where in the past an all-encompassing darkness occupied the space. I noticed the once wary sunshine that had been reluctant to cast its prisms over the house, now showered the grey lady in golden prisms of warm light. I could swear in that moment the house was actually smiling at me and almost whispering in my ear, "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, thank you." "So what do you think of the grey lady, Mrs. Peterson?" asked Yvonne MacLeod. "Do you recognise her at all? I bet you don't." "Barely," I said, tears filling my eyes and spilling down my cheeks. "I don't understand. How did you do it? She looks so beautiful. She doesn't look melancholic anymore. It's incredible." "But why are you crying then? You believed in this place when nobody else did. She's been saved. The heavy energy has gone for good." I threw my arms around Yvonne MacLeod. "Thank you, thank you. Can you be sure the portal will not open again? That's the only thing that concerns me a little." "And you ask a very good question." Yvonne nodded to Hawkeye, who presented me with a picture he'd drawn. I stared at it agog. "This looks like a Bigfoot, with a human face. Is that what you've drawn?" I asked, studying the picture curiously. "What's this got to do with the portal?" For the first time Hawkeye spoke. He pointed to the picture he'd drawn. "His name is Danu," he told me. "He is the keeper of the forest. I called him here to guard the portal for you. You will be safe now." "Are you telling me a Bigfoot is actually guarding the portal in the woods?" I asked. The shaman nodded. "His name is Danu. It means gateway keeper." 1 month later. I know you're going to think I'm incredibly horrible, and you're probably right, I am. I didn't want to tell my husband Roland what had been going on with the grey lady, so he'd been kept in the dark about recent developments. I hadn't told him about how the heaviness over the property had been lifted. To all intents and purposes, when he'd seen the grey lady for the first time, I knew he thought he was staring at a nightmare that could never ever be salvaged. He believed that no matter what alterations were made on the grey lady, that she would always exude a very negative, dark, oppressive energy. It had been wonderful to see how Paul Benelodge's own workers had responded when they saw the grey lady again. They were astounded by the transformation, for the house seemed lighter, airier, and happier. I even called the estate agent over to view the place when it was fully completed to gauge his personal reaction. He shook his head in confoundment, and bemused he said, "Well, I never. How the hell did you change this house? It was one of the most miserable houses I have ever beheld, but now it looks spectacular, warmly welcoming. You do realise, Mrs. Peterson, that if the house you bought from our agents had looked like this when you purchased it, you'd have paid a sizable fortune for the property. You saw its potential when no one else clearly did, and I applaud you greatly for that. Let's just say, Mrs. Peterson, if I had the grey lady up on my window now, offers would be flying into our offices like a flurry of autumn leaves. Hats off to you, Mrs. Peterson, for accomplishing the near impossible." I could tell when I was due to take Roland to see the grey lady. He was deliberately procrastinating like a kid who doesn't want to go to school and is feigning a headache. Let's just say on that morning he complained of an upset stomach. First he couldn't find his eyeglasses, he couldn't find his car keys, and finally he conveniently forgot to fill up his truck with gas. Believe me, my husband was stalling like someone putting off a dental appointment for as long as possible. I knew he was dreading seeing his future home, and I hate to say this, but I was enjoying his discomfort. I knew he was in for the surprise of his life, and he had no comprehension how much the grey lady had changed, and I knew he would love the transformation. "Sweetheart," he said to me, when we were driving to the property. I could see he was holding the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. He was certainly not looking forward to this. "What if I don't like the grey lady, and everything you've done to the place?" he asked me gingerly. "What then?" "We're moving into the grey lady," I told him, "whether you like it or not, Roland. Remember, you let me choose our new home. I promise you, you're not going to be disappointed." My husband appeared to be trembling as we began to approach the grey lady. and when we reached the house my husband parked his car and peered out of the windscreen. He let out an audible gasp, climbing out of the truck as he stared at the property in wondrous awe.
"Lizelle,"
he said, shaking his head,
"there is no way that this is the same house you brought me to a few months back. It can't be the same place. This place is beautiful."
"So you could imagine living here then?" I teased.
"Of course I could. This is incredible. I'm in shock. What did you do to the place?"
he asked me incredulously. "I gave the house some tender loving care," I teased. 12 years later, Bobby's account. "My name is Bobby Peterson. I'm 10 years old. I live in the Grey Lady with my mum and dad. My best friend is called Joshua Ferris. He plays at my house very often. We love playing in the wood groves on the property, as there's so much to do in there. We play lots of games outside. My mum does not like me to be cooped up indoors all the time. She says it's bad for kids not to play out in nature, and that too many children are addicted to computer games these days. She doesn't want me to become like one of them. One day me and Joshua were walking through the trees, kicking up dirt, lifting up stones to see what bug we could find lying beneath the stones. That was when we heard a strange, deep humming sound. It wasn't mechanical. It was like a human humming sound. I think I've heard the sounds on television coming from monks before. The whole wood seemed to vibrate with the sound, as everything became brighter. The woods seemed to almost glow. It was like the ferns in the woods, and the trees seemed greener, as if the humming was affecting the colours around us, as strange as that may sound. My friend Joshua was surprised by the humming. He told me someone was on our land, and maybe we should go back and tell my mum, because they were obviously trespassing on private property, because they shouldn't be here. The humming got louder. We knew the person that was humming was walking towards us, so we hurriedly hid behind a tree in the wood grove to see who was coming. I realized they must be very big, because their feet made a booming sound, like if you're hitting a drum very hard. I could hear twigs cracking, leaves crunching. I remember my heart was thumping in my chest very hard. I wasn't scared. I was curious. But I could tell that Joshua was more scared than I was. He's never been brave. I'm the one that's brave out of the two of us. That was when we saw a big ponderous figure walking through the trees, and as it walked in our direction, it was humming this tune. And that was when I realized I was seeing a Bigfoot. Me and Joshua looked at each other, and then back again at the Bigfoot. We couldn't believe what we were actually seeing. This Bigfoot was very big, with a mighty powerful body. He was covered in long, flowing black hair. Joshua and I remained incredibly still, but that was when the Bigfoot stopped, and he looked in the direction of where we were hiding, and that was when I actually got scared. I felt so small, like a bug you could easily squash beneath your feet. The Bigfoot was so big, you see. I didn't know if it would hurt us, but I knew it could sense we were there. I wanted to run away, but my body just froze to the spot. And then he looked down at the both of us when he walked over to us. Then I found myself staring into his brown eyes. They were so kind. It was in that moment I knew I had nothing to fear. The Bigfoot spoke to me. His voice was so masterful, but his language was not one I understood. But when I listened to him, the English words popped into my head like magic.
"Hello, young man. I'm very pleased to finally meet you. I have a message you need to convey to your mother. Do you think you can give it to her for me on my behalf?"
"Sure," I said, nodding.
"Tell her I'm the guardian of the forest, that I have managed to close the portal permanently. It will never be opened again. The creature that caused so much trouble to your kind in the past can never ever come back. He is trapped in his time-space for good. I will be back every few months to check on this place for you. But I assure you, all is well." Then he just glided away and we heard him humming again until it grew fainter. When we got home, we drew a picture of the Bigfoot for my mother and we gave her the message and she said, "Well, I never. Well, I never." So there you are. That's my story. Isn't that an incredible story? Wow, what an amazing story. I loved every minute of it. And how fascinating that this dog man was causing so much trouble on the land. And the moment they eliminated him, the light came on in the Grey Lady. How extraordinary was that?
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.